Ukraine just pulled off one of the smartest and most brutal traps of the war, and Putin's tanks paid the price. Putin thought he had this in the bag. He threw 50,000 troops at Kursk, including 10,000 North Koreans, convinced it'd be an easy win. He was sure his unstoppable tanks would crush Ukraine's forces and make him look like a hero for taking back Russian land. Spoiler alert, that didn't happen. Not even close. Instead, Ukraine saw him coming a mile away, literally, and set up a trap so devastating it left fields covered with burnt-out husks of Russian tanks. Russia's mighty counteroffensive? More like a total disaster. So how did Ukraine pull this off? And why does Putin keep falling for the same tricks? In this video, we're breaking down how Ukraine outsmarted Russia again, the massive losses Putin's forces suffered, and what this means for Kursk going forward. We start with the trap. For much of the Kursk counteroffensive, Russia has been trying to create a foothold for itself on the east side of the Snagost River. The goal is clear: squeeze out Ukraine's bridgehead in Kursk by stifling the route supplies take to the troops it's stationed in the region's north. And Russia has enjoyed some success with this approach. RBC Ukraine says that it's likely the Ukrainian units have withdrawn from fortified positions in Kursk's Olivsky Forest, with those soldiers moving back toward Mala-Loknaya. They've also withdrawn from Deryino, which lies just beyond the Snagost River. But Russia wanted more. Putin's forces intended to capture every settlement they possibly could along the river, essentially creating a buffer zone to prevent Ukraine's troops from moving supplies through the north of Kursk. So far, Russia has failed in these attempts. The Snagost River serves as a natural barrier against Russia's forces, which is why Ukraine chose to fortify around it. And on the other side of that river sit soldiers in elevated positions who are able to see Russia coming and pick off troops and mechanized divisions. So Russia has found itself almost stalemated around the Snagost River. Putin wisely decided to change his approach. Rather than throwing soldiers at Ukrainian fortifications around the river, he switched to dedicating most of his soldiers to breaking through the front lines from the north in Tolsty Lug. The goal remains the same: cut off the Ukrainian supply lines running through the north of the territory it's claimed in Kursk. However, taking Tolsty Lug also means that Russia can conduct even more direct attacks against the Novoivanovka region to Kursk's east. That's a key position for Ukraine. Putin tried to take the settlement at the beginning of the Kursk counteroffensive. Those early attempts failed. Ukraine managed to withstand 5 waves of Russian attacks, inflicting heavy casualties on Russia in the process. Estimates suggest that at least 300 Russian and North Korean troops were killed or wounded in the 5 assaults leading up to November 11th. Ukraine also managed to destroy at least 18 of the 29 pieces of heavy equipment Putin deployed in these offensives, offering a hint that Ukraine was well prepared to spring the trap that it sprung in early December. Back to the December movements. Putin knew that taking Tolsty Lug would allow him to conduct attacks on Novoivanovka from 2 fronts, stretching Ukraine's forces in the region. So the initial Russian attack began. Euromaidan Press says that Russia sent several armored personnel carriers, or APCs, into a large water reservoir in the north of Tolstoy Lug. Their goal was to bypass that reservoir, opening the door for more Russian forces to stream into the region so they could overwhelm Ukraine's forces. The problem for Putin was that Russia had attempted to use this route before during his early attempts to retake Novoivanovka. Ukraine knew he would try again. So it set up constant surveillance in the region using drones carrying thermal imaging equipment to serve as an early warning system throughout the reservoir region. That system was triggered when Putin sent his APCs and Ukraine got to work. Upon detecting the Russian vehicles, Ukraine launched a volley of Javelin anti-tank missiles at the convoy. The Javelin is a man-portable weapon system with an effective firing range of about 1.5 miles. Their missiles are equipped with high-explosive anti-tank, or HEAT, warheads that are capable of penetrating armored steel over 6 times the diameter of the warhead itself, perfect for taking out heavy machinery. Ukraine has used javelins to great effect to take out tanks on its territory during the war. This usage was no different. In minutes, the javelins had made short work of Russia's APCs, leaving the vehicles smoking on the ground. The few Russian soldiers who managed to escape the fiery wreckages of their vehicles attempted to escape into nearby trees, but Ukraine was prepared for that too. First-person view, or FPV drones, were also present around the reservoir. Ukraine used them to track down the soldiers who were now on foot, neutralizing them so that the first wave of Russia's offensive completely broke down. That sounds like a great trap, right? Only that wasn't Ukraine's anti-tank trap. It was just an example of how far ahead Ukraine's thinking is when it comes to anticipating Putin's troop movements. Ukraine would also have known that the purpose of this initial attempt to bypass the reservoir near Tolsty Lug was less about success for Russia and more about figuring out where Ukraine's firing positions were located. Russia now had that information. It sacrificed its APCs to work out where Ukraine would fire from and how quickly it would respond to an attack. Thinking that they knew what they were walking into, the Russian troops plowed forward. Several large waves, each containing between 6 and 10 armored vehicles, including tanks and fighting vehicles, attempted to push through. Those vehicles were accompanied by infantry units, with Russia's idea being to overwhelm what it thought were the only Ukrainian firing positions. It's a strategy that Putin has used constantly throughout the war. Figure out where the enemy is and then just throw soldiers and equipment at the position until their lines are penetrated and they're either destroyed or forced to retreat. The problem is that Ukraine has seen this time and time again. And it was ready. Long before Russia sent its APCs into the reservoir to work out where Ukraine's firing positions were, Ukraine had mined the fields surrounding that key position extensively. As soon as the Russian forces discovered those mines, they saw they couldn't simply circumvent Ukraine's firing positions. Doing so would mean driving their tanks over fields filled with explosives that would destroy their mechanized convoys before they get close to Ukraine. So the Russian waves of tanks had no choice but to follow the singular route Ukraine had created for them, a route that took those tanks directly through a region where they didn't want to be. And the trap was sprung. Several of the Russian vehicles and tanks were immobilized on Dragon's Teeth that Ukraine had set up on the only road Russia was able to travel. Ever since World War II, these small concrete pyramids have stopped tanks in their tracks, leaving them open for counterattacks. The Ukraine war has showed us that Putin still has an antiquated view of ground warfare in many respects. He relies on trenches and tanks to take positions. By using mines to force Russia's tanks to take the route it wanted them to take, Ukraine was able to lead many of them directly onto Dragon's Teeth, immobilizing them and removing their threat. The few tanks that managed to navigate the Dragon's Teeth had other problems. They were out in the open and directly in the sights of Ukraine's firing lines. Each wave Russia sent was met with artillery strikes, javelin missiles, and FPV drone assaults, and the tanks just kept coming. Mechanized assault after mechanized assault fell victim to the same trap, suggesting that the Russian soldiers simply had no clue what to do. Retreat wasn't an option. All the tanks could do was attempt to push forward, while troops from Ukraine's 225th Assault Battalion and 36th Marine Brigade pelted them with munitions. Images from the battlefield published on social media platforms show the extent of the damage. Entire fields are cluttered with the burnt-out shells of tanks and armored vehicles throughout Tolstoy Lug, Nizhny Klin, and Zeleny Shlyak. Some of the tanks were victims of Ukraine's cleverly placed mines. Russia thought it had outsmarted Ukraine by identifying its firing positions and attempting to circumvent them via the surrounding fields. Each tank that went up in flames following the explosion of a mine revealed that Ukraine knew exactly what Putin's forces were up to long before they even sent in the first APC wave. Other tanks lie immobile on Dragon's Teeth, not destroyed but still abandoned by their crews, and more fell victim to javelin and artillery fire, being turned into smoking husks while trapped in a firing line that Ukraine brilliantly tricked them into following. Euromaiden describes the scene as a graveyard of tanks and other armored vehicles. There can be no more accurate description. Putin's forces were humiliated in their attempt to bypass the reservoir near Tolstoy Lug. They're still no closer to taking Novoivanovka, and Putin is going to be forced to rethink his strategy once more. The odds are that he'll just land on throwing more soldiers and equipment at the Ukrainian positions, because if he's shown us nothing else during this special military operation, it's that he's willing to sacrifice his soldiers to get what he wants. All of this was a bad enough humiliation for Russia, but it gets worse. Russia is still trying to push through to Novoivanovka. The difference now is that it's trying to rely on pure infantry assaults, according to Ukraine's 24th Assault Battalion. Russia's armor, its tanks and fighting vehicles, were destroyed so quickly by Ukraine's trap that it doesn't have any left to restock its troops. The 24th Assault Battalion believes that the few reserves Russia has in its warehouse in Kursk have now been exhausted. Putin's only strategy now is to throw soldiers at the Ukrainian positions on foot. That isn't going to work. Ukraine has already shown how easily it can pick off the soldiers who escaped their flaming vehicles using FPV drones. The Russian soldiers who are trying to break through on foot now are little more than sitting ducks for a Ukraine that was more than ready for the predictable tactics Putin would use to try and take Novoivanovka. Right now, Vladimir Putin and his cronies are trying to figure out what went wrong in Tolstoy Lug. We have some answers. Russia's first problem was that it completely underestimated Ukraine's strength around the Tolstoy Lug region. That shouldn't have happened. Putin had tried to push through the region before. His assaults leading up to the November 11th failure showed us that. And Ukraine had an inkling that he would try to do it again. That inkling led to Ukraine setting up its FPV drones to surveil the area, meaning it saw Russia's APCs coming, and with the APCs came the likelihood of waves of mechanized units to follow. For some reason, Putin seemed to think that he could try the same thing that had failed weeks before and achieve better results. He didn't seem to realize that Ukraine would use the weeks between November 11th and the beginning of December to further fortify its positions around Novoivanovka in preparation for another assault. Russia's approach has become too predictable, and that's been a problem for Putin for over a decade and a half at this point. As European Security and Defense points out, Putin has been making the same mistakes in Ukraine that he made during his ill-fated attempt to invade Georgia in 2008. That conflict, sometimes mockingly referred to as the 5-Day War because of its brevity, saw Russia attempt to invade Georgia with poorly trained conscripts who lacked the proper training for a ground offensive. It also exposed a raft of technical issues in Russia's military. Its communication systems were so antiquated that they were easy prey for Georgia's electronic warfare tactics. The country's equipment was also in poor repair, with far too much of it breaking down and becoming unusable during Russia's march into Georgia. Once Russia finally arrived into Georgia, its troops were exhausted and the Georgians were ready for them. Over the course of 5 days, Georgia destroyed, damaged or captured 93 pieces of Russian military equipment, including 4 tanks, 21 infantry fighting vehicles and 8 aircraft. Logistics were poor, rear support barely existed. Russia basically went into Georgia, feeling that it could steamroll the country using manpower and larger equipment numbers, only for that strategy to fall flat on its face. Does that sound familiar? Despite the Russian armed forces supposedly undergoing extensive reforms in the wake of the Georgia debacle, not a lot has changed in the country's approach now that it's fighting Ukraine. It's still sending poorly trained conscripts to the front lines to get them torn up by its enemy's guns and artillery. Equipment breakdowns are as common as they ever were, and Putin has shown that his tactical nous extends to sending in tanks and troops while relying on better numbers to overwhelm positions. It's all so predictable. And it's this predictability that allowed Ukraine to spring its anti-tank trap. It knew exactly what Russia was going to try, because it had both tried it before and had consistently failed to evolve its tactics during nearly 3 years of war. The Tolstoy Lug tank trap is just one of many examples of Ukraine cleverly predicting what Russia will do next. But there are a lot of other reasons Russia lost. Ukraine's understanding of layered defense also played a massive role. Euromaiden says that Ukraine's use of layered defenses played a huge role in allowing it to successfully spring its trap against Russia. You've seen how this defensive strategy works in our recounting of the incident. The Javelins and FPV drones Ukraine used when Russia sent in its APCs acted as the first layer. The mines planted in the field were the second, with the Dragon's teeth lining the path that Ukraine forced Russia to take being the third. Then there was another layer, more drones and Javelins along with artillery. A December 2022 article published in the Defense Post highlights that this layered defense is nothing new for Ukraine. When tackling Russia's own drones, Ukraine relies on combining aircraft and drone patrols with ground-based anti-air missiles and small units of soldiers on the ground. You'll see plenty of parallels with its approach to the Russian tanks in Tolstoy Lug here. Ukraine doesn't rely on a single form of defense to block Russian advantages. It creates several, often using them in stages to force Russia to act in the way that Ukraine wants it to act. It's very intelligent defending. And the fact that Russia still doesn't seem to be able to figure it out tells us a lot about Putin's tactical ineptitude. As soon as the mechanized divisions trying to bypass the reservoir in Tolstoy Lug discovered the mines in the field, they should have known that Ukraine was leading them into a trap. A retreat and regrouping should have followed, with Russia coming up with an alternative way to assault Novoivanovka, even if that meant losing a few tanks to Javelin strikes during the escape. But no, Russia kept moving forward into the next layer and then the next, and then its tanks were decimated as a result. Putin's mistake here is that he just doesn't learn. Coupled with his failures to adapt his tactics, you get a 1-2 punch of strategic fragility that allowed Ukraine to set its trap. Then there's the equipment problem, another massive blunder on Russia's part. Russia's forces are now trying to break through to Novoivanovka on foot, telling us that something's gone wrong with the supply lines that are supposed to be feeding them the tanks and armored vehicles they need for the assaults. What's gone wrong is simple: Russia is running out of equipment. Forbes also reported on Ukraine setting up what it dubbed a road of death on the road moving past Zeleny Shlyak. It's the road that Russia attempted to take into Novoivanovka. Forbes reported on a video that shows at least 10 destroyed vehicles along the road, with the 225th Assault Battalion claiming that the fields are mined, the road is targeted by our artillery, and every movement is carefully monitored. Forbes reports that Putin is sticking to the same strategy of constantly attacking down the road near Zeleny Shlyak, and the tale the images from the Road of Death tell is of a Russia that's running out of equipment. During the initial assaults in October and into early November, Russia used BTR-82 infantry fighting vehicles. Apparently, soldiers on the front lines in Kursk received at least 40 of those vehicles. Fast forward to December, and those BTR-82s are running out. The new wreckages on the Road of Death appear to be BMP and BMD tracked fighting vehicles, a definite downgrade from the BTR-82, along with some armored tractors and Buran trucks. It won't be long before these weaker vehicles will disappear too, forcing Russia into relying on whatever makeshift mechanized units it can provide to its soldiers, assuming it sends any at all. Just a quick reminder, this is Russia fighting in its own country. It looks like Putin is either running out of armored vehicles inside Russia, or he's done such a bad job of setting up logistics that the vehicles Russia does have aren't getting to the soldiers who need them. Things are getting so bad for Russia that it's being forced to use trucks in place of tanks, and when those trucks run out, it's sending soldiers on foot. Between August 6th and November 26th, Russia lost 364 units of heavy equipment, ranging from tanks to trucks. With the Tolstoy Lug trap sprung, it's just lost dozens more of those vital pieces of equipment. So what does all of this mean for Ukraine's attempts to defend Kursk? On the one hand, Russia is enjoying some success. It's managed to take back about 40% of the territory Ukraine claimed during its initial incursion. Having 50,000 soldiers versus 20,000 is an advantage there. Putin's meat grinder tactics have worked to a point. But on the other hand, Tolstoy Lug shows us that Russia still hasn't figured out how to attack the most fortified positions Ukraine has in Kursk. Instead, it's just trying to batter them down with tanks and infantry, with both falling prey to Ukraine's layered defenses and superior tactics. Will Ukraine manage to repel Russia's counteroffensive? That remains to be seen, but what we can tell from this one incident is that Ukraine is outsmarting Russia every step of the way. If Russia manages to retake Kursk, it'll do so at the cost of tens of thousands of troops and hundreds of units of heavy equipment. A Pyrrhic victory, if there ever was one, for a nation that's already struggling with manpower and equipment problems. But what do you think about the trap that Ukraine sprung in Tolstoy Lug? Will Ukraine be able to keep using traps like these to keep Russia's soldiers at bay? Or is it only a matter of time before Putin has sacrificed enough troops and equipment to break down the Ukrainians' layered defenses? It has been dubbed the largest missile and drone strike against Ukraine so far. On August 26, 2024, while still licking his wounds following the humiliation of the Kursk invasion, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered a concentrated missile and drone attack that struck several cities in Ukraine. ABC News called it a nightmare strike that targeted 15 regions in the country, with Russia launching at least 127 missiles and 109 drones during an 8-hour attack. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky labeled the attack dastardly, while pointing out that Russia was once again using its missiles and drones to hit civilian infrastructure. By the end of the strike, at least 7 people were dead and another 47 injured, with 4 of those 47 being children, according to Ukraine's State Emergency Service. Still, it could have all been so much worse. The reason it wasn't is that Ukraine was able to defend against this missile and drone attack not only with the air defense systems it's used since the beginning of Putin's special military operation, but with a weapons platform that Zelensky has long said Ukraine needed. A weapons system that's capable of shooting cruise missiles out of the sky and over time may help to put Ukraine on a more even footing with Russia in the aerial battle. We're talking about the F-16. As well as being the day in which Russia launched its largest missile and drone strike against Ukraine, August 26th also marked the first time that Ukraine used F-16s to fight against Russia. In this video, we're going to provide a full analysis of how Ukraine used its new multi-role fighters, what its plans for the F-16s are likely to be in the future, and the challenges it still faces in establishing any form of aerial superiority over Russia. But first, a recap. Since the beginning of the war, Zelensky has argued that American-made F-16s could play a huge role in helping Ukraine turn the tide. The planes, he believed, would allow Ukraine to create small pockets of air superiority over Russia's enemy, particularly when used as part of combined ground operations, as Ukraine attempts to seize back territory Russia had snatched from it. But Zelensky was made to wait and wait. In July 2023, several countries including Norway, Denmark, Belgium and the Netherlands formed a fighter jet coalition through which they pledged to deliver 85 F-16s to Ukraine. That might give you the impression that Ukraine received these fighter jets in 2023, but that wasn't the case. Before those planes could be sent to Ukraine, its pilots needed to undergo an extensive training program to learn how to use them. After all, these are pilots who have traditionally used older Soviet-era platforms, such as the MiG-29, and it would take them months to get up to speed on the F-16. The American multi-role fighter traditionally has a training program that lasts for 18 months. Even with that training being fast-tracked into a 6-month program, it would still be a long time after the coalition commitment was made before the F-16s would arrive in Ukraine. "It's been 18 months and the planes have not reached us," Zelensky proclaimed in July 2024, adding that he believed having F-16s would help Ukraine to unblock the skies over his country. The good news for Zelensky was that he wouldn't have to wait much longer to get his hands on F-16s. On August 4, 2024, Zelensky stood at an unnamed airbase in Ukraine, flanked by 2 of the first batch of 6 F-16s the country had received. "F-16s in Ukraine, we did it," he said during the ceremony, in which he thanked the coalition leaders who had made this possible while stressing that Ukraine would need many more. Those extra F-16s will come. It's believed Ukraine will have received 20 of them by the end of 2024, with another 65 waiting in the wings. But these first 6 will go some way to boosting Ukraine's air force so it can move away from the old Soviet systems upon which it's been forced to rely. Fast forward a little over 3 weeks and we arrive at August 26th and Russia's nightmare missile and drone attack. It was time for the F-16s to show what they could do. Sandbox News provided details about how Ukraine is using its F-16s in its August 27th report on Russia's missile and drone strike. It noted that of the 127 missiles and 109 drones that Russia sent to Ukraine, the vast majority were intercepted or shot down before they reached their targets. Ultimately, 102 Russian missiles were downed, along with 99 of the 109 drones. Ukrainian anti-air defenses were credited with the majority of these interceptions, but Sandbox claims that reports were coming in that Ukraine had deployed its F-16s for the first time, with those multi-role fighters taking part in a defensive effort that saw them shoot down several cruise missiles that were on their way to Kyiv and other locations. From there, the report became more speculative. Sandbox revealed that it wasn't known how many of its F-16s Ukraine had deployed in this defensive role, or exactly what types of missiles the planes had shot down. It notes that it's very unlikely that the F-16s were used to take out ballistic missiles, such as the Iskander-M, as their flight profiles make them difficult for the F-16 to counter. Instead, Sandbox says, it's much more likely that these F-16s played a part in taking down the bevy of surface and air-launched cruise missiles that Russia threw into Ukraine. It points to the Russian Kh-101 and K-59, both of which it says operates more like tactical aircraft than ballistic missiles when they're in the sky. These missiles are powered by jet engines, similar to those used in older jets, giving them a heat signature for the F-16's missile systems to track. Because of those jet engines, the missiles also fly at lower altitudes and take a more horizontal flight path than ballistic missiles. However, the fact that they top out at speeds of between 600 and 700 miles per hour means they have no real means of defending themselves against a fighter jet that can fly faster and track them via their engines. Add to this that Ukraine has already revealed that the F-16s they've been showing off were seemingly loaded with air-to-air munitions, such as AIM-120B missiles and Sidewinder missiles capable of using infrared targeting, and it's clear that Ukraine intended to use its new planes as air defense assets. That's precisely what it appears to have done during Russia's extensive missile and drone attack, with the F-16s being used to take out cruise missiles, while Ukraine's other ground-based anti-air defenses focused on the ballistic missiles and drones. Sandbox says it's most likely that Ukraine was using AIM-9M Sidewinders, which have a range of around 10 miles, meaning any plane firing them would have to get up close and personal with a target. Given that F-16s can fly at speeds of up to 1,345 miles per hour, as well as reaching cruising speeds of 577 miles per hour, it's very feasible that Ukraine used them to track, catch, and then obliterate these types of Russian cruise missiles Sandbox notes were used in the attack. It's even possible, though perhaps unlikely, that Ukraine took advantage of the M61 Vulcan 20mm rotary cannon built into the F-16. These 6-barrel cannons can rattle off an impressive 7,200 rounds per minute, with the caveat being that they're only really effective when the F-16 is within 2,000 feet of its target. They may have been used, though they would have required a pilot to get very close to a cruise missile, creating the risk of a debris cloud upon contact that could damage the F-16. Still, from all of this, we gain some insight into how Ukraine is using its F-16s. This initial batch, at least, appears to be a supplement to the country's aerial defenses. The F-16s weren't deployed on or behind the front lines and have yet to be used by Ukraine in combined efforts with ground-based soldiers. Instead, they're taking out missiles intended for targets on the ground in Ukraine, with their likely focus being to take out cruise missiles that Ukraine's ground-based anti-air systems can't track. A second missile and drone attack, launched just 2 days after the Nightmare attack, offered more insight. Sadly, it also showed just how much risk an F-16 pilot takes whenever they climb into the cockpit. According to a report by the Task and Purpose YouTube channel, Russia launched a second missile volley at Ukraine on August 29th. This one wasn't as large as the Nightmare attack, as it involved just 5 missiles and 74 drones fired at Ukrainian power generation facilities. However, Ukraine responded by sending an F-16 to take out as much as it could. That's when tragedy struck. The F-16 sent to take out the missiles and drones was piloted by Colonel Alexei Mess, who Politico says had long been a fervent advocate of delivering advanced fighter jets to Ukraine. On August 29th, Mess, who went by the handle Moonfish, was piloting one of those very jets during an aerial battle that saw him tackling the Russian missile and drone assault. He didn't make it. In a statement released by the Ukrainian Army General Staff, it was revealed that Moonfish had enjoyed some early success against the Russian missiles, shooting down 4 of them using his F-16's airborne weapons. Following that success, Moonfish, who was one of the first Ukrainian pilots to qualify to fly an F-16, encountered difficulties. During the approach to the next target, contact with one of the aircraft was lost. As it turned out later, the plane crashed. The pilot died, read the statement. Ukraine has yet to confirm if Moonfish was shot down or whether it was issues related to pilot or mechanical errors that led to his F-16 crashing. Whatever the case may be, the sad fact for Ukraine is that it's lost both a good pilot and one of the 6 F-16s it's received in the initial delivery, leaving it with just 5 until the next batch comes along. It was a difficult incident for the country, though it came tinged with a minor success. Moonfish had managed to destroy 3 attack missiles and 1 attack drone before his plane crashed. When combined with the much greater success achieved when dealing with the Nightmare Strike that came 2 days prior, it's clear Ukraine is starting to figure out how to use its F-16s to turn the tide of battle against Russia. All of which brings us to a key question. What have we learned so far? Speaking to the Ward Carroll YouTube channel, Professor Justin Bronk, a senior research fellow with the Royal United Services Institute, says that these early engagements show Ukraine is taking a cautious early approach with its F-16s. So far, we're not seeing a huge amount of what the Ukrainians are doing with the F-16, which in many ways is quite encouraging. It suggests they're being fairly cautious with them. It suggests that they're probably concentrating on working out and practicing the dispersed operation model, said Bronk. This early caution is smart on Ukraine's part, as it means it's tempering the elation of finally having F-16s with the reality that only had 6 of them as of the creation of this video. So it's deploying them in a limited defensive manner. There are no confirmed uses of the F-16 near the front lines, which Bronk points out is a far more dangerous use. They're also not being used to support the Kursk invasion, meaning Ukraine is either still working on the best strategy for a more offensive deployment, or it's biding its time until more of the promised 85 F-16s arrive in the country. Of course, these early engagements aren't risk-free, as we saw with Moonfish, but Ukraine choosing not to use its F-16s on the front lines right now means it believes the jets are best used in isolated engagements, which brings us to their current air defense role. Task and Purpose points out that the F-16 Ukraine lost wasn't flying near Kursk, and it wasn't lost near the borders where active fighting is taking place on the ground. This shows that the early assessments of their usage are correct, with Ukraine preferring to use its F-16s in an air defense role, meaning they will likely play the part of interceptors for the foreseeable future. Interestingly, the same channel also points out a side benefit of this interception strategy. Noting that there are only so many interceptor missiles to go around in Ukraine, Task and Purpose says that F-16s can more easily take out missiles and drones thanks to their advanced sensors, which frees up a lot of the older platforms to tackle riskier missions near the front lines. It sounds counterintuitive, but there's also a logic to this approach. Ukraine's pilots are far more experienced in flying Soviet-era jets that make up the majority of its air force. They know how to get the most out of them, says Task and Purpose, meaning Ukraine can use them to offer close air support to ground troops and conduct harassment missions, while the F-16 patrols the skies over Ukraine, ready to intercept any incoming missiles and drones. This approach also enables some level of training. After all, Ukraine's current F-16 pilots have only undergone around 6 months of training for a platform that usually requires 18 to master. By taking the more cautious approach of using F-16s as missile interceptors, Ukraine's pilots can cut their teeth on less dangerous targets, according to Task and Purpose. Perhaps the strategy is to gain greater familiarity with the platform in the short term, which will enable Ukraine's pilots to use F-16s in riskier frontline missions once the country has received more of its promised stock. That future looks brighter too, thanks to the F-16 opening up a whole new arsenal of weapons for Ukraine to use. Task and Purpose note that having Western jets at its disposal means that Ukraine now has access to the advanced weaponry developed by NATO that it previously was only able to jerry-rig into its Soviet-era jets. The channel points out that Ukraine's jets were forced to use R-60 infrared missiles and R-27 semi-active missiles during the early stages of the war, as those were all that were available, as well as being the only types of missiles the jets could use. Both missiles were developed in the 1980s, making them around 40 years out of date, and they resulted in Ukrainian pilots not having long-range capabilities. Compare that with Russian pilots who are using R-77 active radar missiles, and you see why this is so important. The R-77 has fire-and-forget capabilities, meaning the pilot can pull the trigger on the missile and then move away as the missile tracks its target. Ukraine's missiles required its pilots to keep the noses of their planes pointed at their targets, meaning they couldn't pull away to evade fire. That's all changed with the arrival of the F-16. The jet is capable of firing the AIM-120 AMRAAM missile, which offers both fire and forget and beyond visual range capabilities, with many calling it one of the best active radar missiles in the world. It has a range of over 20 miles and can move at supersonic speeds before delivering a blast fragmentation warhead to a target. With missiles like these, Ukraine doesn't just achieve parity with the weapon systems used in Russian jets, it exceeds them. As more F-16s arrive in Ukraine, it's likely that we will see more of the jets making their way to the front lines to more directly engage Russian jets in the skies. That could change the entire complexion of the war, as F-16s could tackle the planes Russia is using to launch glide bombs and take out targets on the ground to enable advances by Ukrainian soldiers. However, that type of strategy is likely being reserved for the future, when Ukraine is more capable of unleashing the full potential of its F-16s. For now, it's going down a more defensive route, which brings us back to Ukraine's current usage of the F-16 as an interceptor. It's been making the jet even more capable of carrying out its role by implementing new defensive systems. Task and Purpose examined the F-16s that were on display during Zelensky's August 4th announcement of their arrival and noticed that they had new pieces of kit installed beyond their missile systems. An examination of the jet's pylons revealed that some of them looked bulkier than they should, with one even looking like it had small vents and a camera lens installed. That's the combination of pylon-integrated dispensing systems and electronic combat integrated pylon systems, Task and Purpose said, adding that they are additional defensive models created to improve the F-16's survivability. With these systems, Ukraine's F-16s can use jammers capable of spoofing the radar signals enemy missiles produce, preventing them from locking onto their fighter jet while it's in the air. The systems are even powerful enough to confuse ground-based anti-air systems, as well as larger aircraft. Add an AAR-60 missile warning system to those pylons, which uses ultraviolet light to detect the exhaust plume an incoming missile produces, and you have extensive defensive capabilities. Those capabilities will prove essential as Ukraine continues to use F-16s in an interception capacity. They'll also prove vital should Ukraine ever send its F-16s into direct combat with Russian fighters on the front lines. By now we're getting a clearer picture of the Ukrainian strategy. It's using F-16s to intercept missiles and drones for now, all while preparing its pilots for a future in which it has more of those aerial platforms available, which may allow it to run more advanced operations closer to the front. Even if that future doesn't come to pass, the use of F-16s may free up Ukraine's Soviet-era aircraft to operate on the front lines in safe knowledge that the F-16s are protecting key Ukrainian military installations. And there's more. Returning to Justin Bronk's conversation with Wade Carroll, Bronk says that Ukraine has been attacking Russian air bases with large missile salvos already. By bringing F-16s into those strikes, Ukraine develops a greater chance for success, which will put more pressure on Russia to evacuate its air bases, relieving pressure on Ukraine in the process. Ukraine can potentially try and blend missile and HIMARS attacks to create this pressure, Bronk claims, which will result in Russia pulling more of its jets further back. Not only does this lower the risk of Russia sending glide bombs and its own jets into Ukraine, but it also creates space for Ukraine's F-16s to operate on the front lines with less risk of encountering Russian fighters. Even if Russia goes down the opposite path and creates layered defenses at its air bases near the front lines, Bronk claims, that will mean offering less defensive capacity to troops and installations that are actually on those front lines. Again, that would create opportunities for Ukraine's F-16s, allowing them to operate at lower risk as they'll face fewer defenses. This creates a win-win situation for Ukraine. Risk is lowered either because Russia is pulling back, which also helps Ukraine's ground troops, or it's lowered because Russia's frontline defenses are sent to its air bases, giving the F-16s more room to operate. Again, this is likely a strategy for the future. Ukraine will need to receive more than the number of F-16s promised to it to make this pressure tell. All of that brings us to the ultimate goal Ukraine wants to achieve with its F-16s, preventing Russia from gaining or retaining air superiority. As faltering as Russia's efforts to gain this superiority have been, given that it's lost 368 planes and 328 helicopters already, it's at least been able to rely on its aerial might from behind the front lines. Glide bombs are launched from bases Ukraine can't reach, for instance, allowing Russia to rain explosives down on Ukrainian targets with little recourse. Brock says the foreseeable future of Ukraine's F-16 strategy is not to gain air superiority, it's to prevent Russia from gaining air superiority. With Brock noting that even with its full fleet of F-16s, Ukraine will still be facing a Russia that has a fleet somewhere in the region of 350 genuinely modern and capable fast jets that are individually at a technical level significantly more capable than the F-16 in most metrics. So Ukraine's goal is to be capable of defending its skies rather than using its F-16s to operate with impunity over the front lines. That's an achievable goal that, if Ukraine realizes it, will relieve the pressure placed on its key military installations and troops on the ground. With his aerial options restricted, Putin will be forced to either waste more of his missiles and drones on strikes, cutting into his already dwindling supplies, or simply send more soldiers into a war that's already cost Russia over 630,000 military personnel. In the end, it's about imposing cost, argues Bronk. That's seen in the Kursk invasion and the long-range missile and drone strikes Ukraine has used against Russian energy facilities and its Black Sea fleet. Ukraine's new F-16s are likely going to become an extension of that strategy. They'll cost Russia valuable missiles, while helping Ukraine simply not lose the war long enough for its other strategies to really add up, to the point where Putin may have to pull out based on cost alone. Still, there's one thing that's being underestimated when it comes to Ukraine's use of the F-16: the impending arrival of the Saab 340 aircraft. In May 2024, Sweden announced that it would donate 2 of its Saab 340s to Ukraine, in a move that flew somewhat under the radar. With all the hubbub about Ukraine receiving F-16s, Task and Purpose suggests that the arrival of these planes could be a real force multiplier in terms of how Ukraine is able to leverage its F-16s. Why? Because it's a radar aircraft that's capable of spotting incoming threats before the F-16 systems can locate them. An F-16 without being backed up by this type of radar aircraft is like shooting a rifle without an ACOG, or Advanced Combat Optical Gunsight scope, says the channel. The Saab 340 will serve as that scope. Though it's essentially a twin turboprop plane, the Saab 340 comes with a high-tech radar system and the ability to communicate the data it retrieves directly to an F-16 in the field. So the Saab 340 will track incoming missiles and similar threats at extremely far distances, allowing it to send tracking data to the F-16s so they can eliminate the threat. The arrival of the Saab 340 will reinforce Ukraine's use of the F-16 as an interceptor, making it far more effective than it currently is. And that, more than anything else, can make Ukraine's F-16 capable of turning the tide of the Ukraine war. With Saab 340s at their sides, Ukraine's F-16s become cruise and ballistic missile destroying machines, creating enormous costs for the Russian military while making their future missile strikes less effective. Perhaps that's why the Russian company Forez, likely under advice from Putin, is offering a 15 million ruble reward to the first soldier who manages to shoot down an F-16. That bounty, which amounts to about $170,000, is a sure sign that Putin needs Ukraine's F-16s out of the sky so he can continue his special military operation in the way he envisions it. Of course, there are still challenges ahead for Ukraine. The 6 F-16s it's received so far, or rather 5 now that one crashed, are far from enough to allow Ukraine to establish air superiority. They also aren't enough for Ukraine to fully realize its defensive strategy, meaning Ukraine can't start sending its Soviet-era fighters to the front lines yet. There's also the training issue to confront. 6 months of training has made Ukraine's pilots capable, but they're not at the stage where they can get the most out of the F-16 systems yet. Flying defensive missions, which are relatively low risk compared to frontline sorties, can boost flight hours, but there's still a clear skill gap that needs to be filled. It's also worth pointing out that Ukraine doesn't have access to the most modern weapons the F-16 can use. The US and NATO may not want to risk the most advanced weapons providing an intelligence coup for potential adversaries, claims Task and Purpose, while pointing out that Russia may be able to reverse engineer anything that it captures from crashed F-16s. There's still plenty of good news for Ukraine to take away from its first use of the F-16. It knows the jets are capable of shooting cruise missiles out of the sky, and that its pilots are well trained enough to make use of the planes. More flight hours will only build on this training, opening up further options in the future upon the arrival of the Saab 340s and the rest of the promised F-16 stock. And if Ukraine can maintain as many of its F-16s as possible, it's going to be able to use them to chip away at Russia's aerial and missile forces, as well as potentially offer support to its ground troops to drag Russia even deeper into a war of attrition that's already cost Putin and his military heavily. The F-16s aren't going to turn the tide of the war alone, but Ukraine's clever usage of them so far suggests that they'll become a vital piece of the Ukraine war puzzle, that when combined with Ukraine's other cost-creating strategies, will put and keep Putin on his back foot until he's forced to negotiate. What do you think about the arrival of the F-16s in Ukraine? Has Ukraine used them effectively so far, and do you think it will change up or build on its current strategies once more of these multi-role fighters arrive? How has Ukraine, a smaller country, managed to rise and humiliate Putin's war machine? 2.5 years in, Ukraine's resilience is undeniable, while Russia's military stumbles and Putin's grand plans unravel. What's behind Ukraine's unexpected strength, and how is it turning the tide against one of the world's biggest military powers? In this video, we'll explore the real reasons that Ukraine is not just surviving but thriving, and why Putin's Russia is crumbling under its own weight. A big part of Ukrainian optimism can be attributed to the enormous amounts of financial and military support that other countries have provided so far. While public support across much of the world is pretty overwhelmingly in Ukraine's favor, the actual benefactors so far have been the NATO member states. Combined, they've provided roughly 99% of all financial and military aid. According to the Kiel Institute, total financial and military aid to Ukraine has amounted to roughly 185 billion euros, roughly $204 billion, with the US being the biggest provider overall. Additionally, Kiel estimates that there is a further 100 billion euros in aid that has not yet been allocated as of June 30, 2024. Of course, these numbers are not fully up to date, and there are some inconsistencies in the way Kiel's tracking aligns with that of various governments, but the overall figures suggest that Ukraine is on track to receive more than $300 billion worth of financial and military aid by the end of 2024. Part of this aid has been in the form of direct financial support to help the country recover as its economy became fully war-centric. According to some estimates, Ukraine is spending roughly 40% of its GDP and 60% of its total revenue on military and national defense, figures that are practically unheard of in modern countries. For reference, the US spends about 3.4% on its military, and Russia's 2024 budget suggests that it's spending around 7% of GDP and 40% of the total government budget on its military. But the bigger, or rather more important component of aid to Ukraine has been the wide range of military equipment and ammunition that's been donated by the US and other NATO countries. These weapons are what have been keeping the country afloat and repelling the Russian invasion to date. Most notably, it's the defensive weapons, tanks, and infantry support vehicles that have made the biggest impact for Ukraine so far. We'll cover them all briefly to give you an idea of why they are important and how they stack up against their Russian counterparts. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has long been adamant about the pressing need for Ukraine to receive F-16s in order to start turning the tide of the war, and for a good reason. The F-16 is pretty much on par with some of Russia's most modern fighter and multi-purpose combat jets, such as the Sukhoi Su-35 and MiG-29, and their ability to incorporate various types of both air-to-air and air-to-ground missiles could make a massive impact on the war. Ukraine's ability to field a fleet of relatively modern fighter jets would allow them to push back on Russia's ability to launch strikes from afar and control the flow of the invasion. Both Russia and Ukraine have robust defensive capabilities in place to deal with the other side's missiles and drone strikes. However, for the first 2 years of the war, Russia has had an overwhelming advantage due to actually being able to use their airplanes over the Ukrainian sky without much retaliation from Ukrainian air forces. By Ukraine's estimate, the country needs roughly 128 F-16s in order to field a fleet comparable to Russia's and to start using their jets on more effective offensive missions. The current allotment of 65 F-16s from various European countries, only signed off by the US at the end of 2023, is a great start to reclaiming Ukrainian airspace sovereignty. Additionally, the F-16s that are being delivered aren't exactly standard by any measure. Footage and reports from the field show that while the donated F-16s are relatively old and were in the process of being mothballed by their native countries, they have been retrofitted with more advanced early warning systems to detect incoming missiles. These upgraded EW systems, plus a few other choice upgrades to the radar and electronic warfare systems, push the Ukrainian F-16s firmly into the modern age of warfare, arguably making them more useful than Russia is currently capable of fielding. This all goes to show why the sight of F-16s making their first flights over the Ukrainian sky in August 2024 was such a pivotal moment in Ukraine's pushback against Russia's offensive. The F-16s have become yet another layer in the country's already resilient anti-air defenses. However, the US has issued a caveat to the deployment of these jets. Ukraine can't use them for offensive operations on Russian soil, at least for now. But that might be changing, and quite soon, due to something else that Ukraine has done, which we'll cover a bit later. Before we get there, let's take a look at the differences between NATO-provided tanks and those that Russia and Ukraine have been working with so far. Both sides have relied heavily on Soviet-era tanks, in particular the famous T-type tanks, such as the T-72. Russia is one of the few countries that retain the capacity to produce T-type tanks, while Ukraine inherited a part of the Soviet arsenal when the Union dissolved in 1991. Russia has also upgraded the T-line, culminating in the T-90 and the T-90M tanks, along with the apparent failure that is the next-generation T-14 Armata. As a result, the Russian army has been using T-90s, T-82s and T-72s as the main battle tanks driving their offensives forward through the Ukrainian landscape. On the other hand, NATO has provided Ukraine with additional T-72s, since the Ukrainian army has the most knowledge and experience working with these models, along with US-made M1 Abrams, German-made Leopards, and UK-made Challenger 22s. What all the NATO-made tanks have in common is that they need one more crew member than the T-72, while also being heavier and more durable than Russia's T-90s. The specific armaments for each tank differ slightly, with the Challengers needing UK-specific ammo to function, making the UK basically the only country that can supply it. On the other hand, Leopard 2s are widespread throughout Europe and have been donated by various countries, with Poland, Germany and Spain some of the biggest contributors. The M1 Abrams is the flagship US main battle tank, used to great effect by the US Army since the late 80s. But perhaps more importantly, what all these tanks have in common is that they don't suffer from the same fatal flaw that the T-tanks fielded by Russia all share. The T-90 and its earlier versions all have an autoloader system that stores spare ammunition in a separate container below the main turret. While this allows the tanks to fire comparatively faster relative to their Western counterparts, the ammo stockpile itself is shielded by a relatively thin piece of armor. Although it may be sufficient to protect against traditional gunfire and even tank rounds, anti-tank mines and kamikaze drones can puncture this armor from directly below or above the tank. If that happens, the ordnance's detonation can set fire to the ammunition in the tank, resulting in what can be described as an explosive decapitation that destroys the entire tank. Considering that Ukraine has also been one of the main playgrounds for modern drone warfare, this has been a serious problem for Russian ground forces. These are not the large drones like the famous US-made Predator B, officially the General Atomics MQ-9 Reaper, which costs $32 million each and can be used for both recon and seek and destroy missions. Ukraine has been shifting to using commercial drones, retrofitted with anti-tank mines or bombs that can be remotely set off when needed. It's these drones that can effortlessly track down and destroy T-type tanks, and the number of tanks that Russia has lost as a result is estimated to be a staggering 8,900, more than the US military fields in total. The other class of land vehicle that's performed admirably in Ukrainian hands is infantry support vehicles. In particular, the reigning champions of NATO donations in this category have been the M2 Bradleys provided by the US. The Bradleys have more robust protection than their Russian equivalents, the BMP line. A Bradley's armor stops 30mm ammo around the whole vehicle, while Russia's BMP-3 is only protected against those rounds in the front. The older BMP-2, Russia's main infantry fighting vehicle in the war, can only withstand 23mm rounds on its frontal arc. Furthermore, the Bradley has more advanced optic systems, including the SADA-2 thermal sight that is also used in M1 Abrams tanks. Baseline BMPs are not equipped with thermal sights, making them relatively useless in low-visibility environments by comparison. Finally, the Bradley's main armament, the M242 autocannon, can fire independently and accurately while the vehicle is on the move, giving the Ukrainian army superior mobility and strategic advantages. For example, 2 Bradleys were able to dispatch a Russian tank using autocannons alone. Alternatively, a Bradley can also carry an anti-tank mortar, with one such vehicle destroying 2 Russian tanks all by itself. While the tanks and infantry support vehicles have been vital to Ukraine in fending off offensives such as the aforementioned summer offensive in Kharkiv, Russian long-range artillery fire has been one of the main reasons Ukraine hasn't been able to make a significant push to free its occupied territory. NATO has provided plenty of artillery support, including the HIMARS system with a range of roughly 50 miles and the ATACMS mid-range missile that can reach 180 miles. However, Russia has enjoyed an overwhelming numerical advantage. Additionally, the Russian Iskander SS-26 missile has a maximum range of 300 miles, outranging Ukraine's artillery by some distance. Moreover, Russia has upgraded its Soviet-era howitzer artillery, such as the 2S-3, with the more recent models, such as the 2S-19, capable of achieving sustained fire over 7 rounds per minute and even up to 10 rounds per minute. Russia makes 3 million artillery rounds per year, compared to NATO only delivering 1.2 million a year. This has enabled Russia to leverage its howitzers to create mid-range walls that Ukraine wasn't able to plow through. Or rather, it wouldn't have been able to if Russia hadn't been using its howitzers purely for offense and not for defense too. While Russia was busy utilizing howitzers to push into Ukraine's east agonizingly slowly, largely thanks to NATO-donated land vehicles and defenses, Ukraine had another brilliant idea. It pushed into Russia. On August 6, 2024, a small contingent of Ukrainian soldiers and supporting vehicles crossed into the Russian region of Kursk, which is on the northeastern part of the border between the two countries. Initial reports could only be found from the Kremlin, which quickly announced that the invading force would be dealt with, labeling Ukrainians as terrorists in a long-standing attempt to justify its special military operation. After a few days, it became clear that Russia hadn't set up a proper response to the incursion in Kursk. Instead, they left poorly equipped local defenses to deal with the approaching Ukrainians. What followed was a wave of Russian soldiers surrendering their posts. According to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, the 3-week-long invasion led to the capture of close to 600 Russian soldiers. A report from a prison processing the prisoners of war suggested that up to 80% of the defensive forces inside Russia consisted of relatively fresh conscripts. An interview with one of the POWs suggested that the conscript had as little as a week or two of basic combat training before being sent to the border with Ukraine. It should be noted that while Russia does have mandatory conscription, and it's using it to replenish its ranks at a rate of roughly 300,000 conscripts per year, the conscripts are legally not allowed to be deployed abroad. That left the poorly trained soldiers to defend various Russian regions bordering Ukraine, seemingly in the hope that Ukrainian intelligence wouldn't figure it out. But Ukraine did, and took full advantage of this oversight on Russia's part. The invasion of the Kursk region turned into a resounding success for Ukraine, which seized roughly 500 square miles of territory, displacing between 120,000 and 200,000 Russians as a result. When compared to the Russian advances of 2024, Ukraine managed to occupy as much land in 3 weeks as Russia had in the past 7 months. This demonstrates the lack of effectiveness in the Russian army, even when Ukraine was only partially outfitted with NATO weapons. The invasion in Kursk opened the door for Ukraine to seize more territory and make more aggressive moves in several ways. Firstly, the artillery support that Ukraine brought along enabled it to bombard the vital bridges and supply lines that Russia could use to reinforce Kursk. This would theoretically allow Ukraine to take more Russian territory whenever it saw fit. Russia's only recourse would be to remove some of its long-range capacity from the Eastern Front and point it at Kursk. This would give Ukraine more breathing room to defend Donbass, one of the main goals of the Kursk invasion. Zelensky said that Ukraine planned to control Kursk for as long as possible, presenting a clear signal to Russia that Ukraine is fully capable of putting offensive pressure on Russian territory while holding onto its own. Additionally, the neighboring region of Belgorod was a target of a similar, albeit unsuccessful incursion in 2023, and Ukraine ramped up its attacks on that region throughout August of this year as well. This escalation is likely in line with the same diversionary tactics that Ukraine is using to try and force the Kremlin to ease up on aggressive operations on the Eastern Front. But the invasion of Kursk opened up another can of worms for Russia by crossing one of Russia's so-called red lines for using nuclear weapons. Over the course of the war, Russia has frequently pointed to various events that would be sufficient cause for it to use nuclear weapons on Ukraine or NATO members in response. Most of these red lines have been related to proposed NATO donations to Ukraine. For example, the delivery of F-16s was only approved in late 2023 due to NATO's hesitation to cross Russia's red line objections to their possible use in targeting Russian military compounds. The red line supposedly crossed in Kursk was the use of NATO donations to facilitate Ukraine's invasion of Russian territory. However, the invasion largely happened independently of NATO donations, and NATO intelligence claims to have had no knowledge of Ukraine's invasion plans until the day of the invasion itself. The lack of a nuclear response to the invasion showed that Russia was impotently threatening the West for helping Ukraine, at least in terms of Ukraine's actions thus far. This has only served to embolden Ukraine, culminating in the first ever large-scale drone attack on the Russian capital Moscow in late August. The attack showed that Ukraine has sufficiently built up its offensive capabilities to threaten Russia, and not just in the industrial and rural parts of Russia, but Moscow itself, which has been largely unaffected by the war so far. This leads us to another way in which Ukraine is trying to disrupt Russia's war effort by lowering morale and diminishing the effect of Russian propaganda. Throughout the war in Ukraine, Russia has been using cyber warfare to sow discord among the West and to push the idea that Russia's special military operation in Ukraine is justified to its own citizens. One of the main reasons why the propaganda has worked is that the main population centers such as Moscow or St. Petersburg haven't been affected to a life-changing extent by the war. Russian conscription and military recruitment efforts have nearly universally targeted either the poorer regions of Russia or Russian convicts. The draw for the poorer regions has been quite simple: money. The Russian military has been offering salaries between 3 and 4 times higher than the national average to attract contract soldiers. A report by PBS suggests that ethnic minorities have been disproportionately represented in Russian death tolls compared to the country's overall demographics, with one report stating that 6 of the 10 regions with the largest number of casualties are in Siberia. By demonstrating that Ukrainian drones and missiles can actually reach the Russian seat of power, Zelensky has sent a message that Moscow residents are not safe from the war, and since that will inevitably be felt by ordinary Russians and within Western nations, the hope is that Kremlin propaganda could evaporate in practically an instant. But even if Putin doesn't actually rely on buy-in from the Russian population to stay in power, Ukraine has another trick up its sleeve. It can attack the oligarchs upon whom he definitely does rely. The economic sanctions put in place by the West when Russia first invaded had a staggering effect on Russia's economy, particularly on its international trade. Russia has relied on its oil and gas exports to fuel its economy for decades, which has allowed owners of energy companies to rake in billions in profit. When the sanctions hit, Europe pretty much cut off its oil trade with Russia, countries such as China and India stepped up to soften the blow, allowing Russia to recoup its losses and even bounce back economically at a time when the rest of the world was just starting to recover from the COVID pandemic just a year earlier. In 2023, bilateral trade between China and Russia hit an all-time high of $240 billion. But the Russian oil and gas supply model is one of on-demand exporting, where the oil refineries are essentially pumping out products for both export and internal consumption. As such, Russia doesn't actually have a significant stockpile of export-ready oil. Ukraine has capitalized on this oversight by launching drone attacks against oil refineries in the Russian southwest, near the Ukrainian border. Why are these refineries located there when the bulk of the oil is in Siberia? Before the sanctions started, the EU had been the main importer of Russian oil and gas, so refineries were set up near Russia's European borders to provide more efficient and cost-effective supply to EU markets. But now what was once Russia's advantage has turned into its potential downfall. As a result of widespread internal deficits due to Ukraine striking down its oil refineries, Russia has banned gasoline and diesel exports to most countries that weren't part of the Soviet Union. While this might cause the volume of Russian crude oil exports to rise in the short term, it will also increase Russia's reliance on China and India as its main customers. This presents a problem for the Russian oligarchs, who are making fortunes from Russia's exports to Europe, as much of their influence derived from their connections in the West. Since the East now holds the reins of Russia's economy, Putin has started targeting oligarchs with the aim of nationalizing many private companies in the energy sector. This means that the network that has supported Putin's rise to power has started to unravel, and Putin and the oligarchs could be scrambling to take each other out before either one or the other becomes obsolete. This has caused Russia to become increasingly isolationist on the geopolitical stage, to the point that it started recreating Cold War-era practices. These might have worked when the Soviet Union's economy was on par with the US's, but now Russia barely manages to make it onto the top 10 economies. What's more, Russia's biggest trading partner is China, the world's second biggest economy. As a result of sanctions, China's products are starting to monopolize the Russian market, and if this trend continues, Russia might have to face its local manufacturing industries being replaced completely by China, making it even more dependent on China's vast market and geopolitical influence. As we previously mentioned, Russia's local economy has become increasingly dependent on exports, with more and more money being funneled into national defense. These discrepancies are pushing the country's elite out of the equation. In the first year of the war, roughly 900,000 Russians left the country, mostly people with lucrative jobs in the upper brackets of earnings. Losing most of its able and educated manpower will eventually cause Russia to become even more dependent on trade and more vulnerable as a result. If China decides that it no longer needs Russia's oil, for example if it completes the Belt and Road Initiative that aims to definitively connect it to Saudi Arabia, the Russian economy might just disintegrate. On the other hand, Ukraine has become a beacon for democracy and Western support. After the resounding success of the Kursk invasion, the US announced yet another round of financial and military aid, this time including a new Patriot missile anti-air system. This addition will make Ukraine even more resilient to Russian attacks, and together with the new F-16s flying over Ukraine, help it carve a direct path into Russian airspace. Additionally, NATO military chiefs have sided against the administration in the US by supporting Ukrainian efforts to use the donated weapons to perform long-range strikes into Russian territory. While Ukraine has been partially successful with deep strikes conducted solely via drone warfare, the use of more advanced and deadly systems such as ATACMS missiles poses another threat to Russia's ability to supply its economy with the oil it needs and its front lines with more soldiers and military equipment. And this support by NATO for Ukraine to go on the offensive is what might ultimately push the war to an end. Since one of Putin's red lines has already been crossed, NATO weapons facing Russia, even if operated by Ukraine, present a level of threat that Russia has yet to face throughout the previous 30 months of war. Considering how ineffective previous saber-rattling initiatives by the Kremlin have been in stopping the flow of NATO firepower, Putin is running out of options and fast. One of the responses from the Russian president has been to implement an amendment to Russia's nuclear defense policy, further justifying the use of nuclear weapons against Ukraine and NATO should the US provide more offensive weapons. This threatened escalation is something that NATO has to take into account and consider seriously whether Putin would actually pull the trigger if it comes to that. These shifting Russian red lines are further evidence of the country's failing geopolitical pressure on the US. Zelensky has already proposed a so-called victory plan to Biden, although the latter wasn't particularly thrilled with it. So both countries seem to have different ideas as to how the war might pan out in the months and years ahead. However, Russia keeps moving its goalposts to be more on the defensive, while Ukraine keeps pushing for more offense, and public opinion across Europe shows support for either Ukraine winning the war or the countries being forced to reach a peace agreement. According to a poll conducted in Ukraine and 14 other European countries, over 55% of the respondents believe these to be the most two likely outcomes. For Ukrainian respondents in particular, 70% believe that Ukraine can win the war, so long as NATO keeps donating weapons. Most respondents also believe that the war will end either within the next year or within the next 5. What this means is that so long as Ukraine can get its hands on more NATO-provided weapons and defense systems, Zelensky might be able to push Putin to make a move that could cost him his seat on the throne, or even dismantle Russia as it exists today. But what do you think? Is there merit to Ukraine's plans to push into Russia, or will Russia find a way to win the war? The war in Ukraine has raged for over 2 years, and in that time, Ukraine has achieved significant victories against a formidable adversary. Despite a challenging start to 2024 marked by relentless missile and drone attacks from Russia, Ukraine's resolve has remained unshaken. Instead of collapsing as some experts predicted, Russia ramped up its aggression with the hope of breaking Ukraine's spirit through sheer force and brutality. But Ukraine has not only withstood these attacks, it's turned the tide, demonstrating remarkable resilience and strategic prowess. How has Ukraine managed to defy the odds and start winning again? And more importantly, can this momentum continue until Ukraine secures a definitive victory? We've got the answers in this video, so stay tuned. Firstly, it's important to understand that Ukraine's actions aren't solely responsible for the country's victories on the battleground. Sure, Ukraine is fighting back as fiercely as ever, not letting Russia gain any permanent foothold, due in large part to the military aid from the US flowing again into Ukraine, which has begun to turn the tide in the war. But believe it or not, there's another major factor that can be partially credited for Ukraine's success: Russia. That's right, the very country Ukraine is fighting against has inadvertently contributed to its setbacks. With this in mind, let's see how each of these factors has played out on the battlefield and what they mean for the future of the conflict. Ukraine's resilience and strategic brilliance have been crucial to its success so far. These were the driving forces behind the highly successful 2022 Ukrainian counteroffensive that the country hopes to replicate in 2024. With that in mind, let's briefly revisit the key moments from 2023 to understand where Ukraine is in its current counteroffensive. On June 11th, the Ukrainian 68th Jaeger Brigade, supported by a few territorial defense battalions, managed to recapture the village of Blahodatny, making it the third settlement to be liberated by Ukrainian forces during the counteroffensive. Around the same time, Ukrainian forces also recaptured Storoziva and Novodorivka in eastern Zaporizhia and western Donetsk, successfully breaching Russia's first line of defense in the region. On June 17th, Ukraine launched a massive attack on the Crimea Bridge, marking the second time this vital structure was hit. This time, marine-based drones used in the attack managed to destroy a portion of the bridge, killing 2 people. The attack in question was important for 2 reasons. One, disabling or even disrupting the bridge that connects the occupied Crimean Peninsula to mainland Russia and allows the movement of military supplies and reinforcements, is a significant strategic blow to Russia. And 2, this attack once again proved that Ukraine is more than capable of penetrating Russia's defenses and that none of the Russian facilities, no matter how important, are truly untouchable. On August 24th, Ukraine revisited Crimea, this time sending in an elite squad to raid the peninsula's western coast. This was also Ukraine's first official incursion into the Crimean Peninsula since Russia illegally annexed it in 2014. Symbolically, the raid took place on Ukraine's Independence Day. The unit landed near the village of Olenivka, killed 30 Russian soldiers, raised a Ukrainian flag, and safely returned home. This incursion alone displayed Ukrainian defiance and courage in all its glory, once again showing why the country received such widespread support in its fight against its oppressor. Courage was on display once again on August 28th, when Ukrainian forces penetrated the first line of Russia's southern defenses in the Zaporizhia region, despite this line being heavily mined. This breach was made possible by long-range field artillery provided by NATO allies, which have an average range of between 18.6 and 24.9 miles, according to a Ukrainian Brigadier General, Sergei Baranov. He explained that these weapons made it possible to destroy or damage the enemy's guns, as well as to move the enemy's artillery from the front line into the depths and prevent counter-battery warfare against Ukraine's artillery. On March 12th, Ukraine carried out the most sweeping unmanned aerial attack inside Russia since the invasion began. The attack spanned 9 Russian regions, primarily targeting energy facilities, including the country's 4th largest refinery, Lukoil Norsy, some 500 miles away from the Ukrainian border. Proving that it can prevail on all fronts, Ukraine also launched an important attack on 2 warships in the Crimean port city of Sevastopol on March 24, 2024. The warships in question were amphibious landing ships, the Yamal and the Azov. In addition to these ships, this huge overnight attack also damaged a communication center and several other facilities belonging to the Black Sea Fleet. Celebrating the attack, the commander of the Ukrainian Air Force, Mykola Oleshuk, wrote on social media, "The sky and the sea are of the same color. I thank the pilots and Navy for their successful combat work. Crimea is ours. To the victory together." Ukraine has seemingly retained the same unyielding spirit in 2024, though the nature of the conflict has drastically changed. This time, Ukraine is mostly on the defensive, as Russia is the one launching a major summer offensive. However, one thing remains the same. Ukraine is still scoring one victory after another and, more importantly, preventing Russia from doing the same. As for Ukraine's major current wins, they mostly use the same modus operandi. For instance, on June 30th, at least 7 Ukrainian drones hit the Novolipetsk metallurgical plant in Lipetsk Oblast, damaging an oxygen separation unit and causing a fire. This was the 5th strike against the same plant in 2024 alone, demonstrating Ukraine's persistence in targeting critical infrastructure. What makes the Novolipetsk metallurgical plant a critical target is the fact that it's the largest producer of steel and high-value added steel products in Russia. Ukrainian drones have also continued to strike Russian oil refineries, radar stations, and other critical military targets. The latest attacks focused on Krasnodar, a city across the Kerch Strait from Crimea, and Yeysk, a town housing a military airfield. As for the offensive operations, Ukraine has shelled parts of Russia's Kursk region, as well as intensifying attacks on the Belgorod region. This area borders Ukraine's Kharkiv region and has been under near constant attacks since the beginning of the invasion. Ukraine also targeted this region in the summer of 2023, which Russia spent months preparing for, fortifying the 600-mile-long front there. The region has been persistently attacked due to Belgorod's status as a major logistics hub for Russian military activity. However, Ukraine's arguably most decisive victories are taking place in the bordering region we mentioned, the Kharkiv Oblast. So far, Russia's Grand Kharkiv push has failed to materialize, partially due to Ukraine's fierce defense and partially due to Russia's incompetence. As a part of the much-discussed summer offensive, Russia started intensifying attacks on the Kharkiv Oblast in May 2024, officially opening a new northern front. On May 23rd alone, at least 15 Russian S-300 long-range missiles hit the cities of Kharkiv, Lubotin, and Zolochiv, killing at least 7 people and destroying civilian infrastructure. Russian soldiers have also swarmed Kharkiv, with some 2,000 troops being part of the front line in the initial ground attack, according to Ukrainian military commentators Konstantin Mashevets and Alexander Kovalenko. Reportedly, another 2,000 soldiers were in immediate reserve, while 4,000 were making their way toward Kharkiv. Thanks to the sheer numbers and an element of surprise, Russian armed forces managed to claim 9 villages in the first 2 days following the initial May attacks in the region. But why this region? According to Russia, the Kharkiv Oblast was targeted in an effort to protect the Russian settlements in the Belgorod region that kept getting attacked by the Ukrainian side. By seizing Kharkiv, Russia could establish a buffer zone, preventing Ukraine from scoring more victories in the region. However, if you know anything about Russia and its President Vladimir Putin, is that there's almost always a hidden agenda behind their military actions. This time, the plan was to open up a new front in the north and draw Ukrainian reserves to defend it, allowing Russia to focus on its true target, the Donetsk Oblast. As Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky puts it, the attacks on the Kharkiv Oblast aim to stretch the Ukrainian forces and undermine the morale and motivational basis of Ukraine's ability to defend themselves. Now, to be fair, this is a pretty standard military tactic, often referred to as a feint attack, and it's usually successful at diverting enemy forces and resources away from the primary target. But not this time. Russia has failed to mount a full-scale attack on the Kharkiv Oblast, which would require Ukraine to commit significant resources to defend the region. Russia has hardly taken any ground in real terms, as retired senior British Army officer Rupert Jones puts it. As a result, Ukraine has managed to stabilize the region by June 2024, gradually pushing the Russian forces back, thus scoring a major win in the ongoing conflict. But why has Russia's Kharkiv offensive failed so miserably? There are a few factors explaining this phenomenon, some external, but most of them internal. Simply put, the Russian armed forces are in total disarray from leadership to frontline soldiers. Leadership within the Russian military has been compromised by frequent changes and questionable decision-making. The lack of stable and effective command has undoubtedly hindered the cohesive strategy execution and operational effectiveness of the Russian military in Kharkiv and beyond. As for the frontline soldiers, they simply aren't trained enough. This deficiency has left them ill-prepared to handle the complexities of urban warfare and sustained military operations, leading them to an almost certain death. Plus, it doesn't help that Russia seems to be fond of the so-called meat grinder strategy, which involves sending waves of poorly trained and ill-equipped soldiers into combat with little regard for their survival. So it's no wonder low morale is another major reason why Russian forces have been unsuccessful in Kharkiv. To put it plainly, their heart isn't in the fight, and how could it be? With the casualties mounting, the motivation to fight being questioned, and the reality of prolonged engagement settling in, the Russian resolve seems to crumble like sandcastles in the rain. Of course, this is a major problem for the country, as Putin's plan for victory entails making gradual advances through consistent offensive operations. On paper, this sounds like a great idea for Russia, as the country should be able to hold any territory it takes. However, the reality on the ground tells a different story. The reality is that Ukraine is fighting back and holding its ground with fierce determination, thwarting Russian advances at every turn. Determination alone wouldn't be enough to achieve such amazing results. This leads us to the final factor aiding Ukraine's victories against Russia: the Western military aid. In fact, the lack of this aid is what allowed Russia to score major victories in early 2024. The $61 billion military aid package was held back in US Congress due to some strong Republican opposition. Without this aid, Ukraine's military grew weaker with every passing day, which Russia used as an opportunity to launch its relentless assaults during the first 4 months of the year. This dire situation started to change on April 24th, the day President Joe Biden finally signed into law a war aid measure worth $95 billion, with $61 billion allocated to Ukraine. $1 billion worth of military assistance was immediately sent to the country in an effort to alleviate the pressure on Ukraine and bolster its defenses against the ongoing Russian onslaught. Now, you might ask the simple question, why only $1 billion? If the lack of military aid has caused such devastating consequences for Ukraine, why not send more aid sooner? That's a good question and a logical one. However, this question also has a logical answer. It simply isn't feasible to deliver huge amounts of military aid instantly due to logistical, political, and strategic considerations. Tons of military hardware is, as you might expect, incredibly difficult to transport from a purely logistical standpoint. Plus, it's not as if the US military has billions of dollars worth of military equipment lying around in a single warehouse, waiting to be sent to its destination. On the one hand, this is a direct result of the post-Cold War peace dividend, which saw significant reductions in military equipment manufacturing, stockpiles, and infrastructure. On the other, it's simply not practical to hold huge stockpiles of weapons for an indefinite period. Some munitions also have a shelf life, so stocking up on them isn't always feasible or cost-effective. If they aren't used by a certain time, they're used for training to prevent them from going bad. Of course, there's always the issue of the supporting bureaucracy, which further complicates the rapid deployment of military aid. It simply takes a lot of time to navigate bureaucratic processes, ensuring that this aid is delivered efficiently and effectively to where it's needed most. So with all these challenges in mind, what's the current state of the US military aid flow to Ukraine? Well, according to Lieutenant General Kirill Budanov, the chief of the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, the truly transformative amount of aid is expected to arrive in Ukraine in mid to late July 2024. Ukraine expects some $150 million worth of weapons and ammunition to arrive, a package that includes the potent Hawk interceptor missiles, which have replaced Ukraine's shoulder-launched Stinger air defense missile systems. The Hawk missiles have an operational range between 28 and 31 miles, can reach an altitude of up to 65,000 feet, and can fly at the maximum speed of Mach 2.4. The Hawk missiles were also part of the $225 million worth aid package delivered in early June, together with HIMARS ammunition and 155mm howitzers. The military aid that has already arrived in Ukraine has allowed the country to reduce the previously substantial artillery advantage Russia had at the start of 2024. Prior to April, Russia held a 7-to-1 artillery advantage over Ukraine. Even if you know nothing about military strategy, you know that such a disparity can only spell trouble for Ukraine. However, with the new influx of Western aid, Ukraine has managed to narrow the gap significantly, cutting it to a 5-to-1 ratio. The more military aid flows in, the more this gap will narrow. However, it's important to note that the delivery of new aid wasn't the only way the West helped Ukraine score victories against Russia. An equally important move was finally allowing Ukraine to use the existing Western-supplied weapons to strike targets inside Russia. Before May 2024, Ukraine was only allowed to use these weapons to defend itself on its own soil. These restrictions heavily limited Ukraine's ability to effectively counter Russian aggression beyond its borders. Luckily, the Western nations, led by the US, UK, France, and Germany, realized the fallacy of this policy in May after Russia launched its Kharkiv offensive. As a result, they allowed Ukraine to use the weapons they'd sent to strike Russian targets around the Kharkiv Oblast. This decisive move allowed Ukraine to thwart Russian attacks before they were even launched by striking military infrastructure and military airfields. However, the Western nations haven't lifted all the restrictions regarding the use of their weapons on Russian soil. Ukraine is still limited to only striking targets near the Kharkiv region and only for defensive purposes. For Ukraine to turn the current series of victories into a full-scale counter-offensive, like the one in 2023, the country will have to be allowed to expand its use of Western-supplied weapons across broader fronts and be allowed to use them for offensive operations against Russian forces not directly involved in preparing an attack against Ukraine. Being allowed to strike, for example, a major military headquarters deep into Russia, which is working on long-term tactics, would make all the difference for Ukraine and its war effort. Again, similarly to the military aid dilemma, you might wonder, why not just lift these restrictions altogether and let Ukraine unleash a full-scale counter-offensive using all available resources? This time the answer is mostly political. The West is simply afraid of provoking Russia and causing an all-out war in Europe. That's why the restrictions on the use of Western-supplied weapons were imposed in the first place. It seems that the Western nations are constantly trying to gauge Putin's so-called red lines and avoid making any moves that would cross them and escalate the conflict further. However, in almost 30 months of conflict, Putin has proven that he's all talk and no action on multiple occasions. This has given the West confidence in adjusting their policies cautiously, balancing support for Ukraine with the need to avoid a broader conflict. In addition to lifting limitations on the use of existing military equipment, Ukraine feels the West can support a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive by keeping the flow of aid coming. Among some Ukrainians, there is a looming fear that the political support for Ukraine in the West is waning as attention is being focused on the conflict in the Middle East. That concern is why Zelensky is pressing for Ukraine to be well-stocked to avoid a repeat of the 2024 delay that cost the country dearly. Among the most desired military aid, air defense systems are always high atop Zelensky's weapons wish list. In his own words, the sooner the world helps us deal with the Russian combat aircraft launching these bombs, the sooner we can strike, justifiably strike, at Russian military infrastructure, military airfields, the closer we will be to peace. Ukraine also needs these systems to deal with Russian reconnaissance drones, which report in real time, allowing the country to launch sudden, devastating airstrikes. If Ukraine manages to get all these in order, spring of 2025 is a totally realistic timeframe for a counteroffensive. A more pressing timeframe isn't necessary for now, as Ukraine isn't really under huge operational pressure from Russia in 2024 thanks to its fierce resistance. So let's say Ukraine does launch a massive counteroffensive in 2025, following a successful 2024 campaign. Will the country be able to go all the way, turn the tide completely, and secure a lasting victory against Russia? It's possible, however, numerous pieces of the puzzle must fall into place for this to happen. Chiefly, the Ukrainian forces will need consistent and substantial military aid from the West, not only in terms of weapons but also logistical support, training, and intelligence. Ukraine must do all in its power to be in a better position than Russia when the time comes to resolve the conflict once and for all. As Rupert Jones puts it, "He who dominates events on the ground, take the spoils." Of course, by this point, no one is foolish enough to think Russia will simply roll over and concede. Even now that Ukraine is winning once again, Russia isn't showing any signs of stopping. The country seems to be preparing for a long-term war, as signaled by a major change in Russia's military leadership. Specifically, Sergei Shoigu, an experienced military officer, was replaced as Russia's Minister of Defense by Andrei Belyusov, an economist. This shocking move sent a clear message: Russia's economy will now be fully mobilized for war. Russia's attacks still keep on coming despite its failed attempt to seize Kharkiv. On a peaceful Saturday, June 29th, Russian forces fired missiles at the town center in Vilnyansk, close to the southeastern Ukrainian city of Zaporizhia, in a vicious midday attack that killed 7 people and injured 31 others. The death toll also included 2 children. There were no military targets there, simply townspeople enjoying a weekend day off from work, as confirmed by Ivan Fedorov, Zaporizhia's regional governor. Later, as this very video is being prepared, Russia hit an airfield in the Poltava region, located between Kyiv and Kharkiv, with Iskander missiles on July 2nd. So it's clear that Russia is still sticking to the by all means necessary approach to war in Ukraine. Because they had suffered from one counteroffensive in 2023, Russia undoubtedly learned from the experience. Since that counteroffensive, they have established a multi-layered defense system consisting of the following: Number 1. The construction of anti-tank ditches, designed to halt or slow down advancing armored vehicles, forcing them into a vulnerable position where they can be more easily targeted by Russian forces. Number 2. The installation of zigzag trenches, which prevent Ukrainian forces from firing down the entire length of Russian fortifications. Number 3. Assembling Dragon's Teeth barricades, rows of large concrete pyramids that block or impede the movement of tanks and other vehicles. Number 4. Planting minefields, which have already caused plenty of trouble for the Ukrainian forces. And number 5. Positioning steel hedgehog obstacles, aka large, spiked metal structures designed to block and damage vehicles, adding another layer of defense to thwart any advances. But even faced with these obstacles, Ukraine could still prevail, provided it receives all the support it needs. After all, Russia has proven incapable of defeating even a weakened Ukraine, let alone one bolstered by renewed Western aid and strategic support. Of course, this failure is a direct result of the resilient defenders Russia is up against, as well as its declining military with poor training, discipline, and morale. Russia's inability to seize opportunities that have virtually landed in its lap can also be explained by the incompetence of the Russian military leadership. It seems that most of its tactics boil down to bludgeoning its way forward with brute force, with little regard for the enormous attrition in the process. Ukraine, on the other hand, has shown remarkable adaptability and strategic finesse, consistently outmaneuvering Russian troops through innovative tactics. But will this be enough to take down the military mammoth that is Russia and the evil at its helm? What do you think? Can Ukraine continue its winning streak and ultimately prevail against Russia despite the odds stacked against it? And if so, what do you think will be the deciding factor? Ukrainian prowess, Western aid, or Russian ignorance? August 26, 2024, Russia, still reeling from Ukraine's successful invasion of Kursk, is looking for a way to hit back. The response comes on this date, with Russia launching a large-scale missile and drone attack across Ukraine involving both cruise and ballistic missiles. It's among the largest missile strikes on Ukrainian territory since the war began. A massive volley of at least 127 missiles and 109 drones peppered the Ukrainian skies in an attack that lasted more than 8 hours. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was quick to condemn the strike, saying, "And like most Russian strikes, this one is just as dastardly, targeting civilian infrastructure," before adding a key point: Russian President Vladimir Putin can only do what the world allows him to do. That final point is a reference to Zelensky's constant calls for permission to use the long-range missiles its Western allies have provided to strike Russia on its own territory. That permission, specifically from the United States, has not come yet, with Ukraine limited to using American weapons to strike Russian territory near the Kharkiv region. It can't use missiles to strike deeper into Russia, yet. That may all be on the verge of changing as Ukraine starts a slow move away from relying on externally provided weapons. It's building a weapon of its own, completely homemade, and more than capable of striking Russia at its heart, while giving Zelensky and his troops a key advantage that could ultimately spell game over for Putin's special military operation. What is that homemade weapon? That's the question we will answer in this video as we examine the 2 missiles Ukraine is currently producing, what's made that production possible, and what having these new weapons will mean for Ukraine. But before all of that, we need to look at the background behind why these weapons matter, specifically in terms of how missiles have offered Russia such a massive advantage over Ukraine. The barrage on August 26th is far from the first time Russia has used missiles to strike Ukrainian cities. In fact, the tactic has been a feature of Putin's strategy. On February 22, 2024, the second anniversary of the beginning of Putin's special military operation, Ukrainian spokesperson Yuri Inhut pointed out that Russia had launched over 8,000 missiles during 2 years of war. That amounts to around 77 missiles per week, with many of those missile strikes being accompanied by drones. A staggering 4,630 of them, in fact, with Inhut claiming that Ukraine has managed to destroy 3,605 of those drones during the first 2 years of the war. Still, it's clear that a key Putin tactic is to constantly bombard Ukrainian cities and infrastructure with missiles, heavily burdening the country's anti-air defenses in the process. Russia claims that it only targets military facilities and energy infrastructure with these attacks. The August 26th strike demonstrates otherwise. Russian missiles have been just as destructive in major Ukrainian population hubs as they've been for the country's military locations. And it gets worse for Ukraine. While it finds itself unable to respond to these missile strikes with missiles of its own, Russia is looking further afield to keep the barrages going. On the same day that Inhut released the figures of the sheer volume of missiles his country has to face from Russia, the Security Service of Ukraine, or SBU, revealed that some of these missiles aren't of Russian origin. According to the SBU, several missile attacks launched by Russia in December 2023 involved the use of Hwasong-11 missiles from North Korea, with those missiles having injured at least 100 people while killing around 24 more. The SBU presented evidence to back up its statements, producing Hwasong-11 missile debris it claims it had found on the battlefield. The SBU says that these missiles have been used as part of the shelling of the Zaporizhia region in December 2023, with strikes against Kyiv and Kharkiv in early 2024 also featuring North Korean missiles. Add to all of this, February 2024 also marking the first time that Russia used its Zircon hypersonic missile in Ukraine, and you can see the vital role missile strikes have played in Putin's strategy. All the while, Ukraine has been unable to respond. It had to rely on anti-air defenses, including a pair of Patriot missile defense systems, to try to protect its people as best it could. But outside of using missiles to attack Crimea, which was annexed by Russia in 2014 and is still considered to be Ukrainian sovereign territory by much of the international community, Ukraine hasn't been able to fight fire with fire. Ukraine's allies have already provided some long-range weapons at this point. However, Ukraine hasn't been allowed to use them offensively. And that's been a sore point for Zelensky throughout the war. The Ukrainian president's call to be able to use the missiles its allies are providing to hit Russia in its own territory has been constant and, up until now, largely unanswered. The most recent of these calls came during a September 2024 meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, or UDCG. Held at Germany's Ramstein Air Base, the UDCG meeting saw Zelensky say that Ukraine needs to have this long-range capability, not only on the divided territory of Ukraine, but also on the Russian territory, so that Russia is motivated to seek peace. As has so often been the case, Zelensky received mild pushback from his allies. Al Jazeera reports that US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin subtly claimed that these long-range capabilities weren't needed, as he confirmed that the US would be providing an additional $250 million in military aid. He said that Russia had moved its glide bombs so far back from the front lines that they will be out of the range of American-made ATACMS missiles. What's more, Austin said Ukraine itself has significant capabilities to attack Russia in its own territory that will go well beyond the range of ATACMS or the British-made Storm Shadow missiles. Austin concluded by telling Al Jazeera that America will give everything we can, but not necessarily everything that Zelensky wants. There are a couple of ways we can read into Austin's comments. The first is how they appear on the surface. America's defense secretary seems to be telling Ukraine that it's achieved plenty of success using drones to strike deep into Russian territory. That's true. June 2024 alone saw Ukraine strike 4 Russian oil refineries with drones, with regular attacks in the Black Sea also allowing Ukraine to stop the offensive threat Russia presents from Crimea. To Austin and many of Ukraine's allies, the ability to carry out these drone-based attacks means Ukraine can already strike Russia at range. Add to that the early August invasion of Kursk, and Ukraine appears to be making a good argument for why it doesn't need long-range missiles at all. Zelensky disagrees. However, the second interpretation of Austin's comments could be that he knows something that the rest of the world doesn't. The US doesn't need to supply Ukraine with ATACMS missiles or allow them to use those missiles in Russia because Ukraine is on its way to building perfectly capable missiles of its own. And that brings us to the new Ukrainian homemade weapons. On August 26, 2024, the DW News YouTube channel published a report on Ukraine's efforts to produce its own long-range missiles. While President Zelensky lobbies for these restrictions to be lifted, Ukraine is also building its own guided missiles in the hope of one day becoming self-sufficient, the report claimed. In truth, that self-sufficiency may have come much earlier in the war, were it not for precise Russian strikes conducted in April 2022. In that month, Russia used its missiles to take out a factory that was capable of producing the same guided missiles that Ukraine is now on the verge of being able to produce once again, forcing Zelensky to make repeated pleas to his Western allies to allow him to use the missiles they provide in Russia. The strike put a severe dent in Ukraine's missile production capacities. However, DW News notes that the plant has been rebuilt and likely fortified with anti-air defenses, meaning Ukraine is now preparing to produce 2 missiles that could be real game changers in the war: the Vilka missile system and the Neptune guided cruise missile. Hints of these production capabilities first arrived in July 2024. In a short report, the TASS Russian news agency quoted Zelensky as saying, "Apart from drones, yes, we are dealing with other systems that will give us the opportunity to have a longer range. There has been some research and development." ABC built on the DW News report in late August, revealing that restarting production on the Vilka and Neptune systems wasn't all that Ukraine was up to. The research and development Zelensky mentioned in July 2024 has resulted in the creation of a missile drone dubbed the Palyanytsia. which is named after a traditional type of Ukrainian bread. That name also has a special meaning to Ukraine due to it being so difficult to pronounce that it was able to use it to weed out Russian spies during the early stages of the war. Now the name will take on a whole new meaning as it will symbolize what Zelensky calls a new class of weapon. The point here is simple. Sooner or later, Ukraine won't have to rely on its allies to provide missiles and also beg them for permission to use those missiles in Russian territory. It's building its own, a series of missiles upon which no restrictions can be placed. That brings us to another question. Just what type of damage is this trio of missiles capable of inflicting? We'll start with the Vilka. A Ukrainian-designed heavy multiple rocket launcher, the Vilka fires guided missiles and is based on the BM-30 Smerch design. It's also got a new launcher. The system entered the Ukrainian armed forces back in 2018. The weapon weighs 33 tons and is crewed by 4 people, with it firing 300mm caliber missiles from its 12 barrels. It's also road mobile. The Vilka is equipped with a YAMZ 7511.10 turbocharged engine that can get to wherever it needs to go in order to fire on Russian positions. The problem for Ukraine hasn't been that it didn't have these launchers available. Rather, Russia's April 2022 attack on its manufacturing plant rendered the Vilka useless because Ukraine didn't have the missiles the weapon could fire. Those missiles are dubbed Vilka Ms and they can travel for up to 80 miles. As such, they're not the rangiest of missiles in the new Ukrainian homemade arsenal, though they can certainly fly far enough to cause problems behind the war's front lines. Those missiles are also cleverly designed. They use a GPS-free guidance system, which makes them immune to the type of satellite navigation jamming that can send GPS-guided missiles off course. They're also versatile. A Vilka M rocket can accept several types of warheads, with the rocket's inertial correction system ensuring the stabilization needed to keep the rocket on course. Ukraine demonstrated how it could put these missiles to good use in January 2024. That's when Ukraine conducted a firing test for its missile system, which showed that a Vilka rocket is capable of traveling significantly further than rockets fired via the M142 HIMARS systems the US has provided. Ukrainian ground forces are also reported to have used the Vilka system during their January 2024 attack on Belgorod, which you may recognize as one of the latest regions Ukraine has invaded since it experienced such success in Kursk. With its production facilities back up and running, Ukraine now has the ability to create rockets it needs for its Vilka system. That means we're likely to see a lot more of this launcher as we approach the end of 2024 and move into 25. Most worryingly for Putin, the Vilka is arguably the weakest of the 3 homemade weapons Ukraine is set to bring to the war. Far more damaging to Russia will be the R-360 Neptune guided cruise missile. Like the Vilka system, the Neptune isn't a brand new weapon. It was first introduced during the 2015 Arms and Security exhibition in Kyiv, with its first flight believed to have taken place sometime in mid-2016. With 2017 came further tests as the Neptune was put through its paces alongside the Vilka missile system, though the results of those tests weren't made public. That typically indicates that the tests showed tweaks were needed to get the missile up and running. Another test came in August 2018, this time supported by reports that the missile successfully hit a target at a range of 62 miles. More successful tests came in 2019, which is the same year that the missile was officially signed off. It would start getting delivered to the Ukrainian military in the same year. The missile has made numerous headlines since the beginning of Putin's special military operation. Early in the war, Ukraine used it to hit the Russian cruiser Moskva, with the attack ultimately leading to the sinking of one of the largest ships since World War II. More ships in the Black Sea have also been victims of Neptune missile attacks, including the Konstantin Olshansky and the Kamuna. As for the missile itself, it weighs 1,920 pounds and has an operational range of between 120 and 190 miles. It's capable of reaching subsonic speeds while delivering a warhead weighing 330 pounds. But by now you may have a question. If Ukraine has been using the Neptune since the beginning of the war, why is it being feared as a new homemade weapon? One word: modifications. In April 2024, Army Recognition reported on Ukrainian plans to extend the range of its Neptune cruise missile so that it could fly for up to 610 miles, all while it revealed that it planned to boost production tenfold. That enhanced range would allow the Neptune to strike deeper into the Black Sea region, perhaps even allowing it to reach ships docked in Crimea, and would make it invaluable for striking Russian territory if Ukraine were ever able to create a version of it that could strike land targets. That's precisely what Ukraine has done. On August 20, 2024, Army Recognition reported that Ukraine had successfully developed a version of the R-360 Neptune that's capable of traveling up to 248 miles and has been tweaked so that it can strike land targets as readily as it can hit ships at sea. The new version of the missile has even seen action already. It was reportedly used in a late-night attack on the Chelino military airfield near Kursk, just a week before Ukraine launched its invasion into the oblast. So Ukraine is now capable of producing two types of missiles. When combined, they're capable of striking targets on both land and at sea. With the Neptune, they also have a missile that offers a good amount of range, with that range potentially being extended to over 600 miles if Zelensky's plans are anything to go by. Finally, there's the new homemade weapon. The weapon could prove superior to the ATACMS long-range missiles Ukraine so desperately wants to be able to use in Russia, the Palianitsia. Not much is known about the Palianitsia at the time of writing. When reporting on the new homemade missile, ABC News speculated that the missile would have a range of up to 430 miles, which would put it on par with the ATACMS, allowing it to solve the problems that come with Ukraine not having permission to use American-made missiles inside Russia. Ukraine's defense minister Rustem Umerov also posted about the Palianitsia on his Facebook page, noting that Ukraine is preparing its response when talking about Russia's missile attacks in late August. Weapons of its own production are coming, claims Umerov, who shared the post alongside a map showing several Russian airfields, including the Savozlaika Air Base. This led ABC News to speculate that the upcoming missile would be capable of hitting over 20 Russian airfields from Ukraine, which would put a severe dent in Russia's aerial capabilities. Speaking about the missile with the Associated Press, Mikhailo Fedorov, who serves Ukraine as its technology minister, said, "I think this will be a game changer because we will be able to strike where Russia doesn't expect it today." In other words, the Palianitsia could be seen as an expansion of the tactics Ukraine has adopted since the Kursk invasion. Defending territory is not the only thing Ukraine can do. It's going to attack Russia on its own soil, forcing Putin to completely rethink how he approaches the war that he started. The Kyiv Independent provides more details about Ukraine's revolutionary new missile drone. It quoted a defense expert named Andriy Karuk, who claims that the weapon is essentially a new type of cruise missile, because a cruise missile is an unmanned aerial vehicle with a rocket or, in this case, turbojet engine. Karuk notes that the Palianitsia is a fairly small missile too, likely meaning it will carry an explosive charge in the few tens of kilograms range rather than the several hundred seen in a standard cruise missile. Other analysts dispute Karuk's claims that the Palianitsia is essentially a cruise missile. One of them is Federico Borsari, who works at the Center for European Policy Analysis. He says the Palianitsia isn't a cruise missile because missiles fly at higher speed compared to what we know about the Palianitsia. Instead, he says it's more like a one-way drone that shares some of the characteristics typically seen in a cruise missile. Finally, Alexander Dmitriev, who is an advisor on unmanned automated systems to Ukraine's ground forces commander, highlights the key difference between the Palianitsia and a standard cruise missile. The target of a cruise missile cannot be corrected during the flight, but a drone's can, he says. That's basically the difference. In short, the Palianitsia will be able to pack a larger punch than any of Ukraine's current drones, and it will do so while taking advantage of the same electronic control technology that makes drones so flexible. So the Palianitsia is not innovative in the sense that it's introducing brand new technologies to the Ukrainian battlefield. Rather, its innovations lie in remarkable new uses of technology that already exist. The electronic control technology is adapted from traditional drones, while the lifting wings and jet-powered engines come from existing cruise missiles. Put them all together, and you get a missile that brings range, explosive power, and the ability to change its target based on an operator's commands. That's terrifying for Putin. With the Palianitsia, Ukraine completes a trio of homemade weapons that look set to devastate Russia. But that brings us to another question. When are we likely to see these missiles become common fixtures in the Ukraine war? Ukraine's Minister of Strategic Industries, Alexander Kamyshin, provided some insight during an interview with DW News. When asked how long he thinks it will be before Ukraine becomes self-sufficient, he revealed that it's not production capabilities that are stopping it from doing so, it's money. At this point, we're ramping up local production, but for almost a year, we've been facing a scarce deficit of local government funding because the capabilities to produce are almost 3 times higher than the funding available. In other words, Ukraine has been capable of producing its own weapons, from a manufacturing standpoint, throughout Putin's special military operation. The one thing holding it back is that it hasn't been able to attract the investment needed to produce those weapons. That is now changing. According to Kamyshin, Ukraine and Denmark have come up with a novel mechanism that will allow Ukraine to build the Palianitsia, along with its other missiles, without having to worry about restrictions. Denmark is going to procure from Ukrainian manufacturers and donate to the Ukrainian army, claims the Minister of Strategic Industries. With this help, we can scale up faster because, as I told you, our capabilities are higher than the funding available. Ironically, the agreement to create this mechanism was made at the very UDCG conference during which Zelensky made his most recent plea for Western countries to allow Ukraine to use long-range weapons inside Russia. On June 14th, Ukraine's government portal website offered further details, including a quote from Troelsland Poulsen, who serves as Denmark's defense minister. In addition to committing to support Ukraine's efforts to defend itself for the next decade, Poulsen said, "We are taking the lead in responding to a direct request from Ukraine to ensure that investments are made in Ukraine's defense industry in the near future." Ukraine's Rustem Umerov was also quick to laud the project, noting Ukraine's gratitude to Denmark for taking what he calls a great step in supporting the Ukrainian arms industry through direct investment. Denmark's investment is part of the Zbrojari Manufacturing Freedom Project, which aims to raise $10 billion for Ukrainian arms development by the end of 2024. The Danes' contribution is small compared to the goal, just $28.5 million, but the project as a whole offers Ukraine's allies a brand new way of supporting it. That will worry Putin. He has relied on Ukraine not being able to use missiles in Russia because those missiles come from countries that are wary of crossing a red line and provoking the Russian leader further. Now Ukraine has developed a mechanism through which countries can support its efforts to use missiles in Russia indirectly without having to provide weapons of their own. And that program is going to help Ukraine to develop the Palinitsia, along with its other homemade missiles, so that it can take the fight to Russia. Speaking about the Palinitsia to DW News, Alexander Kamyshin hailed it as a first-in-class Ukrainian product that's fully locally designed and manufactured. He also delivered a stark warning to Putin. "That's the first one to go. Others will follow, and you will see how much we can make." In other words, Ukraine has more ideas in the pipeline. It just needs financial support from its allies to turn those ideas into reality. So what does all of this mean for Putin and his special military operation? For one, it means he can no longer rely on Ukraine only being able to fight against his forces on their own soil. That strategy was already thrown out of the window with the Kursk invasion, which has given Putin a massive problem he needs to solve as Ukraine continues to take and hold Russian territory. Following that up with an invasion of Belgorod means that Putin's headache turns into a full-blown migraine. He has to commit substantial amounts of soldiers and equipment to those areas to try and drive Ukraine out. Now throw Ukraine's Palinitsia into the mix, along with the other missiles it's producing, and Putin has even more issues to counter. The war is no longer about him throwing man after man at Ukraine's fortified positions in an attempt to slowly steal territory out from under Zelensky's nose. Putin's own country, the country he claims to be able to protect as he projects his strongman image, is under direct threat. People are being evacuated, territory is being taken, and now with funding from Denmark and the likelihood of future funding from its other allies, Ukraine has developed a homegrown way to finally be able to use missiles deep inside Russian territory. That puts Putin's military installations close to the front lines at risk. Remember that the Palinitsia is capable of hitting around 20 airfields in Russian territory already, and it could ultimately be the factor that forces Putin to the negotiating table. That has been Zelensky's goal all along. He has constantly called for tangible coercion of Russia to force it into negotiating a peace that will see Putin restore the land Russia has stolen from Ukraine, which includes Crimea. That coercion can't come from international pressure alone, Ukraine's leader believes, and now he has a weapon, several in fact, that nobody can stop him from using inside Russia. The Palinitsia promises to completely change the face of the Ukraine war, to the point where it may be capable of ending Putin's special military operation. But what do you think about this unique combination of drone and missile? Will Ukraine be able to produce it in high enough numbers to truly threaten Russia? Are other countries going to follow Denmark's lead by donating to the Zbrojari Manufacturing Freedom Project? On September 18, 2024, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky stood before the world and made an electrifying statement. Ukraine's victory plan is fully ready. Victory, a word that after all this destruction feels out of reach. And yet here he is, determined, defiant, and ready to lay out a plan to end the bloodshed and bring peace to his country. But what does the plan entail, and how likely is it to work? We've got all the answers in this video. Let's start with who's gotten to hear this plan so far. In politics, timing is everything. That's why it shouldn't be surprising that President Zelensky seized the moment to unveil his victory plan during a pivotal visit to the United States in late September 2024. This was a decisive week for Ukraine, and he had the ears of America's most powerful leaders. Zelensky presented his plan to President Joe Biden, as well as to presidential candidates Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. But Zelensky's pitch wasn't just limited to American leaders. Key allies from Europe were also part of this significant unveiling. The plan was shared with leaders from Britain, France, Italy, and Germany. Notably, Poland wasn't among the countries that got full access to the plan, which didn't exactly sit well with Warsaw. This lack of inclusion stung, and Polish Deputy Foreign Minister Władysław Teofil Bartoszewski made it known. "Poland is not among the countries that received full details of the plan," he lamented. Considering Poland's significant military support, this oversight felt even sharper. Bartoszewski continued, "We provided Ukraine with military aid in the most crucial way. When Germany was talking about sending helmets, we sent 320 tanks." But Zelensky's tour across Europe still wasn't done. He also engaged with NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte to discuss further military assistance and Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration. This discussion highlighted the urgency of strengthening Ukraine's defenses, a key element of Zelensky's victory plan. On October 16th, Zelensky took his plan back home, presenting it to the Ukrainian parliament. The day before, he was invited to present the plan at the October 17th European Council meeting in Brussels by the institution's president Charles Michel. Leaders from 27 nations gathered to discuss military aid to Ukraine and measures to bolster its energy infrastructure, which has been suffering greatly recently. Zelensky reiterated the importance of strengthening Ukraine's position, stating, "We must end this war fairly." But this was just one of the general sentiments of Zelensky's victory plan. His vision goes far deeper. When presenting the victory plan to the Ukrainian parliament members, Zelensky framed the conflict as a multifaceted war. "We are at war with Russia on the battlefield, in international relations, in the economy, in the information sphere, and in people's hearts," were his exact words. Yet amidst the clarity, he recognized the growing fatigue within his own country. His own tiredness was evident as he remarked that victory had become an uncomfortable word for some. Despite this, Zelensky still sees the war as existential. He warned that Russian President Vladimir Putin is continuously strengthening his position, yet he confidently asserted that if his victory plan was supported, the war could end no later than next year. His unwavering belief in his plan was as clear as day. "Ukraine's victory plan is a plan to strengthen our state and our position, to be strong enough to end the war." But what about Ukraine's Western allies and their beliefs? Well, Zelensky framed his victory plan as an investment opportunity for Western allies. He emphasized Ukraine's vast natural resources and economic potential, making a compelling case for continued support. The overarching sentiment of this plan could be summed up in a few words. Victory isn't easily achieved, but it's possible. Zelensky also makes it clear that the victory in question depends on Ukraine's allies, not Russia. He insisted that the only way to force Russia into peace was through decisive military defeat. His victory plan aims to fulfill this ambition. With this in mind, let's inspect Zelensky's victory plan in more detail. This ambitious plan consists of 5 key points designed to fortify Ukraine's defenses and safeguard its sovereignty. However, there's also an air of mystery, as 3 classified appendices remain tightly underwrapped, accessible only to select partners in the international arena. Since we aren't among these elite insiders, we'll have to make do with the 5 public points. First up, Ukraine must receive a formal invitation to join the NATO alliance. This heartfelt plea is at the forefront of Zelensky's victory plan, which shouldn't be surprising, as Ukraine has long sought NATO membership. In fact, Putin has used Ukraine's aspirations to join the alliance as one of the primary justifications for his invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. By presenting NATO's expansion as a direct threat to Russian security, he sought to legitimize his aggressive actions both at home and abroad. However, Ukraine only submitted its official application to join NATO in September 2022, months into the invasion. Of course, this was far from a casual request. It was, and still is, a strategic ambition aimed at securing robust guarantees in a time of unprecedented uncertainty. However, as you know, Ukraine hasn't joined NATO, or been invited to do so. As things stand, NATO views Ukraine as a partner rather than a member. Sure, Eastern European NATO allies enthusiastically support Ukraine's membership aspirations. However, the larger powers, namely the US and Germany, remain hesitant, deeming the current conflict with Russia too precarious for such a leap. While many NATO members have been making encouraging noises about Ukraine's future prospects, many experts, including Maria Zolkina of the London School of Economics, express skepticism about the plan's ability to generate enthusiasm. She notes that Ukraine seems intent on doubling down on its ambitions, but the necessary political will from key allies is still lacking. The reality is that admitting Ukraine to NATO while it's engaged in active conflict could trigger a direct confrontation with a nuclear-armed state. And not just any nuclear-armed state, but the state with the highest number of nuclear warheads in the world. 5,580. That's why in his victory plan, Zelensky makes it clear that he understands that NATO membership is a matter for the future, not immediate reality. "We are a democratic nation that has proven that it can protect our common way of life," he asserts, highlighting Ukraine's resilience and determination. The crux of the matter lies in his belief that an invitation, even one that comes with conditions, would send a powerful message to Putin, demonstrating the West's resolve against aggression and potentially undermining his geopolitical calculations. However, this point of the victory plan is shrouded in complexity. Why? Well, the paradox here is palpable. As Zelensky points out, the perception of a future NATO membership could be seen as a demonstration of resolve. By not extending an invitation to Ukraine now, NATO inadvertently signals a lack of resolve that may embolden Putin. However, sending that invitation while Ukraine remains embroiled in conflict raises the possibility of drawing NATO directly into a war with a nuclear-armed adversary, a possibility no one even wants to risk. However, the risks don't end there. While presenting his plan in Brussels, Zelensky hinted at a potential nuclear option for Ukraine, stating, "Either Ukraine will have nuclear weapons, and that will be our protection, or we should have some sort of alliance." He then added, "Apart from NATO, today we do not have any effective alliances." So basically what he meant was that if the West doesn't step up, Ukraine might have to take matters into its own hands, a risky strategy given the implications of nuclear armament. While one could argue that Ukraine might be justified in reassessing its defense strategy in light of Russia's blatant disregard for international treaties, the nuclear route is fraught with implications. Ukraine lacks the infrastructure to develop nuclear weapons at this stage, and pursuing such a path could provoke dire consequences, including a potential preemptive strike from Russia. Plus, there's the risk of losing crucial US aid if Ukraine were to violate its non-proliferation commitments. The second key element of Zelensky's victory plan is no less controversial. It refers to strengthening Ukraine's defenses against Russian forces. Now, you're probably wondering, how could defending your own country against an aggressor possibly be controversial? Well, the part that makes this point contentious is Ukraine's pleas to use all Western-supplied long-range weapons to strike anywhere on Russian territory. Similarly to NATO accession, this is by no means a new request. But the second point of Zelensky's victory plan isn't only about long-range strikes. No, his vision for strengthening Ukraine's defenses encompasses a much broader strategy. This strategy includes joint operations with European partners to intercept Russian missiles and drones, and bolstering the defensive measures in place to protect Ukrainian cities from aerial bombardments. This need for more robust air defense systems to shield Ukrainian urban centers has also been reiterated time and time again, and this request isn't just for show, far from it. It stems from the pressing reality on the ground, where Ukrainian lives hang in the balance. The echoes of sirens in Kyiv remind everyone that each delay in receiving air defenses can have catastrophic consequences. In addition, Zelensky has explicitly requested assistance in building up Ukrainian ground forces. However, even these parts of the second point aren't without their fair share of challenges. You see, the US and its allies have already provided significant military assistance to Ukraine, yet the consensus on what constitutes adequate support remains ambiguous. For Zelensky, it's not just about quantity, but the quality of the support. Real-time satellite data and intelligence gathering are also crucial elements in countering Russian advancements. The idea is that if NATO allies were to align their strategies and facilitate a seamless flow of information and weaponry, Ukraine would stand a much better chance in this protracted conflict. One particularly innovative idea would be for neighboring countries like Poland to extend their defense systems into Ukrainian territory. Of course, this move would once again risk embroiling the NATO state in the conflict more directly, but it would also provide the much-needed coverage for key Ukrainian cities like Lviv. So for Zelensky, this is a risk, but a calculated one that could shift the balance of power in Ukraine's favor. The same thing can be said for the third point of Zelensky's victory plan, containing Russian nuclear threats. At the heart of this point lies Ukraine's proposal for a comprehensive, non-nuclear strategic deterrence package to be deployed on its territory. The initiative is designed to bolster Ukraine's defenses against any future military threats, primarily from Russia. The strategic vision is clear. Zelensky wants to create a scenario in which Russia faces a choice: engage in diplomacy or risk the collapse of its military capabilities. However, as optimistic as this sounds, many analysts argue that the practical feasibility of achieving such a deterrent effect is limited. The realities of Western military support, logistical constraints, and geopolitical dynamics mean that Ukraine may not receive enough resources to bring about a substantial change in the conflict's trajectory. So what exactly is this non-nuclear deterrent that's so hard to come by? Well, part of that proposal is classified. Well, at least it's supposed to be. On October 29th, the New York Times reported what Zelensky asked for as part of this non-nuclear deterrence package, citing unnamed US officials. Tomahawk missiles. That's what Zelensky wants. These missiles, known for their impressive range of roughly 1,500 miles, could significantly enhance Ukraine's ability to target Russian military installations deep within its territory, far beyond the reach of the currently supplied ATACMS missiles. This makes them a powerful component of Ukraine's proposed non-nuclear deterrence strategy, aimed at containing Russia's nuclear threats while maintaining a defensive posture. However, despite the strategic importance of this request, Zelensky reportedly struggled to convince Western diplomats of its necessity. The prevailing concern appears to be that the number of potential targets far exceeds the stockpiles available without compromising US interests in other global hotspots. Of course, the leak of Zelensky's confidential request to the press certainly didn't help. On October 30th, the Ukrainian president expressed his frustration during a press conference, where he lamented the breach of trust. It was confidential information between Ukraine and the White House. How to understand these messages? So his concerns were not merely about the loss of confidentiality, they also pointed to a broader issue of trust and cohesion between allies. So let's step away from military support for a second and discuss another important form of aid, economic. After all, that's precisely what the fourth key element of Zelensky's victory plan concerns. This fourth component emphasizes the crucial role of Ukraine's natural resources in its economic recovery and growth. Specifically, it outlines a framework for joint protection and exploitation of resources like uranium, titanium, and lithium, which hold significant potential, and not just for Ukraine, but for the European Union and the US too. Zelensky envisions a collaborative approach where allied nations engage in joint investment initiatives to tap these abundant resources, arguing that they represent a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity. Yes, trillion with a T. The idea behind this economic strategy is twofold. First, by harnessing these resources, Ukraine could not only enhance its economic resilience, but also establish itself as a vital player in the global supply chain for critical materials. This would, in turn, provide a pathway for economic self-sufficiency, reducing reliance on Western financial aid in the long run. However, by now, you know there's a huge but coming. Given the extensive damage to Ukraine's infrastructure due to Russian aggression, this point too faces several hurdles. For one, Russian airstrikes have severely impacted Ukrainian energy facilities, leaving much of the country facing significant blackouts, especially as winter approaches. This dire situation underscores the challenges of expanding industrial or mining activities in the short term. Moreover, while the concept of economic empowerment through resource exploitation is appealing, the realities of war present a substantial barrier to immediate implementation. In other words, before any significant economic initiatives can take root, there is a pressing need for either the cessation of hostilities or substantial enhancements to Ukraine's air defense systems to protect vital infrastructure. And given the current trajectory of the conflict, both options appear to be a long way off. In the meantime, Western support needs to prioritize immediate humanitarian and logistical assistance to help Ukraine weather the coming winter, rather than diverting resources into ambitious new economic projects. The fourth point of Zelensky's victory plan also outlines a pathway for Ukraine's EU membership, which is closely tied to its economic recovery. Since applying for EU membership just days after the onset of the full-scale Russian invasion, Ukraine has made significant strides toward meeting the requirements for candidacy. Currently, the country is working to incorporate EU laws into its domestic framework, aiming to solidify its place within European structures. This potential membership isn't only a matter of political alignment, it also represents a significant economic opportunity. Full integration into the EU would facilitate trade, investment, and access to broader markets, essential for Ukraine's long-term economic stability. As part of this fourth point, Zelensky has also made clear that ongoing economic support is critical for Ukraine's reconstruction. The World Bank has estimated that Ukraine will need approximately $480 billion for rebuilding efforts. That's no small change. In response to this urgent need, the Biden administration recently announced a substantial aid boost of nearly $8 billion. Meanwhile, Ukraine has garnered quite the financial backing from both the EU and the US since the conflict began, helping shore up its economy in these turbulent times. According to Germany's Kiel Institute for the World Economy, which tracks global aid for Ukraine, Kyiv received $123.5 billion in assistance from Europe between February 2022 and the end of August 2024. It also received $92 billion from the US in this period. Plus, both donors had committed additional amounts, $80.5 billion and $16.8 billion respectively. For the fifth and final point of Zelensky's victory plan, we're also looking into the future. But this time, it isn't about economic aid, but Ukraine's place in the post-war security architecture. Here, Zelensky is making a rather bold proposal. As part of the key fifth element, Zelensky is advocating for a strategy that would see Ukrainian soldiers stepping into the shoes of US troops stationed across Europe. But why? Well, Zelensky argues that Ukraine has developed a large and experienced military force capable of strengthening NATO and bolstering the security of the European continent. Essentially, he's suggesting that once the smoke clears from the current conflict, Ukraine can contribute to European defense efforts more substantially, freeing up US resources for other critical areas of concern. However, while the notion of a battle-hardened Ukrainian army stepping up to bolster NATO sounds appealing, the reality is more complex. US troops are in Europe not just as a show of force. They extend the critical American nuclear and air power umbrella that's been pivotal in deterring Russian aggression for decades. Would replacing them with Ukrainian units really provide the same level of deterrence? That's a tough sell. So there you have it. Zelensky's 5-point victory plan. As you already heard, each of these points brings along a unique set of challenges, but no one expected an easy road here. Beyond his victory plan, Zelensky took the opportunity to address a few key issues with his MPs. He criticized Russia's allies, singling out China, Iran, and North Korea as a coalition of criminals, with North Korea reportedly supplying both weapons and personnel for Russian factories and military operations. Zelensky made it clear that it wasn't just moral support, but active participation in the war, participation that could easily embolden other potential aggressors. He also took a jab at Putin, describing him as a leader gone mad, with a singular obsession for war. However, this was more than a dig. Zelensky's words demonstrated his concern over Putin's unpredictable aggression and the wider risks posed by unchecked ambition. Turning to Ukraine's allies, Zelensky thanked the US for its support, specifically for the new $425 million defense package that includes air defense systems and long-range weaponry. But let's go back to the victory plan for a second. Enough time has passed for the reactions to roll in, so let's do a quick overview of how Zelensky's plan was met internationally. This will help us determine whether his ambitious proposal can generate the solid backing Ukraine needs. Let's start with the US, a key player in this conflict and its potential resolution. The Biden administration did acknowledge Zelensky's plan, with its reaction being cautiously supportive but tempered by concerns. However, according to the Wall Street Journal, the support aspect is lacking among other US officials. The overarching sentiment is that Zelensky's victory plan resembles a wish list. In other words, they want a plan with more strategy and specific tactics and fewer shopping cart items. Now, across the pond, reactions have been along the same lines. France's Foreign Minister, Jean-Noël Barrot, warned that letting Russia win would bring chaos, yet he stopped short of a full endorsement of Zelensky's plan. Translation: France is on board with Ukraine's resistance, but not necessarily with every bullet point of Zelensky's roadmap. The responses from Germany, the UK, and other European powers weren't exactly roaring endorsements either. As for NATO, Rutte said Ukraine is on an irreversible path to membership. But again, he didn't budge on when that might actually happen. On the other hand, Poland came out with a more blunt perspective. Polish officials expressed solidarity with Ukraine, but Prime Minister Donald Tusk emphasized that it's time for Europe to grow up and rely on its own strength. Even so, there's no denying the ripple effects of US leadership on the global stage. Poland's message regarding Ukraine seems to be, "We're with you, but the US will always play a key role in shaping what comes next." And of course, we have Hungary's Viktor Orbán. In his usual style, Orbán dismissed the plan as terrifying and said Europe should push for peace negotiations instead of fueling what he calls a war strategy. Hungary has consistently advocated for dialogue over escalation, so Orbán's comments weren't exactly surprising. However, they do highlight the fissures within the EU on how to handle the Ukraine crisis. Orbán's stance might not represent the majority, but it does suggest that not everyone in Europe is ready to go all in on Zelensky's terms. Back in Ukraine, the reactions have been a little more enthusiastic, but not without questions. Most Ukrainian officials are backing the plan, but some lawmakers are calling for a bit more focus on internal reforms, especially the kind of anti-corruption measures needed to meet NATO standards. Meanwhile, across the front line, the Kremlin didn't hold back, labeling the plan as pure fantasy. A spokesperson warned Ukraine to sober up and face reality, which isn't exactly a shocker coming from Moscow. Russia has consistently refused to negotiate on anything close to Ukraine's terms, so their dismissal of Zelensky's proposal was more or less a given. In the end, Zelensky's victory plan did make waves, but can it be the tidal force that sweeps away Russian aggression, or will it be just another ripple in a long struggle for peace? Ever since Russian President Vladimir Putin launched his special military operation against Ukraine in February 2022, the war has been marked by a brutal stalemate. Russia floods Ukraine with soldiers and equipment, while Ukraine valiantly defends its territory, occasionally launching counterattacks to reclaim lost ground. For nearly 30 months, this grinding conflict has followed a predictable pattern, largely because Ukraine was restricted from using Western-supplied weapons against targets inside Russia, a move that could have escalated tensions in Europe to a dangerous level. that's all changed. In a dramatic shift, US President Joe Biden, backed by other NATO allies like the UK, has given Ukraine the green light to strike back directly on Russian soil. This bold decision shatters the so-called red line that had held Ukraine back, and is setting the stage for a turning point in the war. Ukrainian forces have crossed into Russia, targeting the strategic region of Kursk. This marks the first time since the war began that Ukrainian troops have moved beyond their own borders. So what does this mean for Putin? Why Kursk? And most crucially, what could this development mean for the future of the Ukraine war? Let's dive into these questions, starting with the most pressing one. What on earth is happening in Kursk? On August 6, 2024, Ukraine broke through the thin Russian line of defenses separating Ukraine from Kursk, allowing its soldiers to enter Russian territory for the first time. This breakthrough went underreported on the day that it happened, possibly because media outlets were taking a wait-and-see approach under the assumption that Russia would quickly push the Ukrainian forces back. That isn't what happened. A day later, The Guardian was among the first to properly report on the incursion, noting that the fighting in Kursk had entered its second day, with reports suggesting that Ukraine's forces had managed to advance up to 9 miles away from the border and deeper into the Kursk Oblast. That incursion had been made possible by a highway running north of Sverdlikovo, a Russian border village that also happens to be close to a key natural gas transmission hub. While those reports were unconfirmed at the time, The Guardian pointed out that both official and unofficial Russian sources were claiming that the incursion had happened and that it appeared to involve several hundred Ukrainian soldiers who had taken advantage of the fact that the border between their country and Kursk is one of the most lightly guarded, from the Russian perspective, on the entire front line. Russia was quick to claim that it had already neutralized the incursion. Its defense ministry claimed the incursion was neutralized on the day that it happened, only to backpedal by the time The Guardian released its report to claim that it was ongoing as of lunchtime on August 7th. Russia also provided details on what it had done to counter the offensive. It says using missile strikes and artillery, it destroyed 50 armored vehicles and inflicted 260 casualties on the Ukrainian forces. Ukraine remained tight-lipped about the entire operation. On August 8th, several other media outlets picked up on the story. These included Le Monde, a French news website, which claimed that Ukraine had actually sent 1,000 troops into Kursk, rather than the previously reported several hundred. It also reported more details on what Ukraine did once it crossed the Russian border. Backed by more than 2,000 soldiers that stayed on the Ukrainian side, defending their position and perhaps preparing to follow the initial 1,000 into Kursk, Ukraine crossed the border with 10 tanks and 20 armored vehicles. That immediately casts aspersions on Russia's claims to have destroyed 50 armored vehicles, showcasing just how difficult it is to ascertain full details of what's happened so far. Once Ukraine crossed the border, Russia declared a state of emergency in Kursk as soldiers advanced on several localities, including a small town named Sudza. These localities were bombarded with Ukrainian missiles and drones, reportedly causing at least 5 deaths and over 30 injuries. Furthermore, the August 6th incursion had resulted in fighting breaking out in Oleshnya and Goncharivka, both in the Kursk Oblast, with Russian soldiers in the latter region supposedly being surrounded and captured by Ukrainian forces. The next day saw Ukraine advance further, according to Le Monde, resulting in the capture of around 20 poorly defended Russian villages, including Gornal, Daryuno, and the previously mentioned Sverdlikovo. Those captures also led to Ukraine taking control of the Sudza gas station, a gas transfer point overseen by Russian energy giant Gazprom that represents one of the few entry points for Russian gas into the Ukrainian gas transmission system. This station matters because it's key to Russia being able to transport gas into Europe, meaning the taking of the station will put a small dent into Russia's profitable energy market. NPR also published a report on August 8th detailing the incursion. It backed Le Monde's claims of 1,000 Ukrainians entering Kursk, noting that the number comes from General Valery Gerasimov, who is Russia's chief of general staff. It also noted that it was the first such offensive carried out by Ukraine. Though it had previously backed small groups of Russian exiles as they carried out limited cross-border raids, the incursion into Kursk was the first time that Ukrainian soldiers had entered Russia since the war began. Putin was left with egg on his face. After spending so much of the war trying to portray Russia as an indomitable power to which Ukraine would crumble over time, he now finds himself having to explain why he's allowed Ukraine to take Russian territory. To rub salt into his wounds, the incursion is far from over. At the time of writing, Al Jazeera is running a live tracker covering the Ukraine war, which says the Ukrainian soldiers are still fighting Russians in Kursk. That tracker also contains a quote from Mikhailo Podolyak, a Ukrainian presidential aide, who pins the blame for the incursion on Russia. The root cause of any escalation, shelling, military actions, forced evacuations, and destruction of normal life forms, including within the Russian Federation's own territories like Kursk and the Belgorod regions, is solely Russia's unequivocal aggression, he wrote in a social media post. Al Jazeera also offers a different number for the tanks that have crossed the border, 24 instead of 10. So the details are still blurry. What we can say for sure is that Ukraine is in Kursk and that it's taken up to 1,000 soldiers over the border into Russia. Those soldiers are accompanied by tanks and armored vehicles, in addition to seemingly having access to missiles and drones. They've used these weapons well. Up to 20 small Russian villages are apparently under Ukraine's control, however temporarily that control might last, along with a key Russian gas station. All of this brings us to another key question. Why did Ukraine choose Kursk? That's a question that the White House has been asking. On the evening of August 7th, the US think tank, the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, published an update on the incursion. It confirmed that US intelligence indicates that Ukraine has penetrated at least 2 of Russia's defensive lines on its sojourn into Kursk, as well as taking a stronghold. It also cited both satellite imagery and geolocation footage to apparently confirm the reports that Ukraine has taken dozens of captives and that it now controls the Sudza gas distribution station. These early reports have prompted the White House to contact Ukraine's leadership to quiz them on the objectives of the incursion. Speaking on August 7th, Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, noted, "We're going to reach out to the Ukrainian military to learn more about their objectives." She also pointed out that the White House supports what she calls common sense actions to stop Russia's attacks. Perhaps the use of the term common sense is a subtle indicator of what the US thinks about the incursion. After all, there appears to be little immediate military value to taking the territory within the Kursk Oblast outside of taking the previously mentioned gas distribution station. And even then, the value is minor. That station sends gas into Ukraine and has likely seen minimal use since the war started. Digging deeper into Kursk itself further demonstrates how it appears to hold minimal strategic value. Though the oblast covers 11,582 square miles, it only contains 1.061 million people, meaning it's far from one of Russia's major population centers. You could argue that its hilly surface and multiple ravines could provide some tactical advantage to Ukraine, assuming it wishes to use Kursk as the launching point for further incursions into Russia, but that seems unlikely. A force of 1,000 isn't what a country sends when it intends to take over an entire oblast. Kursk is a center for agriculture, with farms covering around 77% of its territory and mostly growing sugar beets and wheat, with some fodder crops thrown in for good measure. But again, that's nowhere near enough value to justify an incursion through which Ukraine intends to permanently hold the territory it's captured. Which brings us back to the question, what is Ukraine's goal as it moves deeper into Kursk? The answers don't necessarily have to do with Kursk itself, with the oblast simply being the most convenient available to allow Ukraine to achieve its objectives. Rather, as the BBC explains, the goal may be an entirely different piece of territory, Donetsk. Donetsk, which is part of the wider Donbass region, has been a key target for Russia ever since Putin's special military operation started, and symbolically the Donetsk region is somewhat tied to Russia. A large portion of its people are ethnically Russian and speak Russian as their primary language. Granted, those ethnic Russians don't make up the majority of Donetsk's population, unlike what we saw in Crimea in 2014 and beyond, but there's certainly a Russian influence in the region. After all, as DW points out, it was in Donetsk and the surrounding regions that opposition to Ukraine's 2004 Orange Revolution and the Maidan protests of 2013 and 14 were strongest. The Donbass itself has been no stranger to war even before Putin invaded Ukraine. 2014 saw pro-Russian separatists proclaim both Donetsk and Luhansk as people's republics independent of Ukraine, likely with the goal of integrating them into Russia. The point here is that Donetsk offers symbolic importance to Russia. With that symbolic importance comes a continued push to take the region since the beginning of the war. That's why Russia has committed so many soldiers to Donetsk. Tens of thousands of Russian troops have been poured into the region, with Russia also focusing on developing a nearly impenetrable front line through which it pushes against increasingly weakening Ukrainian resistance. Glide bombs pepper Donetsk daily, with the taking of Donetsk setting the stage for Russia's later successes in overtaking the fortress towns of Avdiivka and Bakhmut. In short, Russia is dedicating a ton of its resources to Donbass and Donetsk in particular, which makes what's happening in Donetsk all the more interesting since Ukraine entered Kursk. Speaking to the BBC, a military analyst named Mikhailo Zhirokov points out that Russia has been forced to redeploy some of the soldiers it had stationed in Donetsk following the Kursk invasion. If you look at the official reports, he claims, there were significantly fewer Russian glide bombs dropped in the Donetsk area. That means the aircraft which carry them are now elsewhere in Russia. Elsewhere is likely Kursk. Ukraine's Kursk incursion has been a success in terms of pulling Russian forces away from a region in which they were previously focused. That may have been the goal all along. Throughout the course of the Ukraine war, Russia has succeeded in focusing the brunt of the fighting in areas in which it wants to take. That's logical, as the invading force, Russia essentially forces Ukraine to react by sending troops to whichever areas on which it focuses. This natural ebb and flow of the war has resulted in Russia leaving scant defenses across some areas of the front line it shares with Ukraine. The northeastern borders, which Ukraine crossed to enter Kursk, were some of the most minimally defended of all. So what we're likely seeing with the Kursk incursion is Ukraine forcing Russia to divert troops away from regions that Russia considers a priority. In creating those diversions, Ukraine weakens the Russian front lines in Donetsk, perhaps opening the door for counterattacks against Russia's offensives. If nothing else, the diversions offer a reprieve to Ukrainian soldiers near Donetsk, who are being bombarded by Russia's glide bombs, giving them time to regroup and reorganize their defenses. Ukraine is essentially keeping Russia honest. It's forcing Putin to realize that he can't be complacent when it comes to taking on Ukraine. Any weakness he displays, such as not reinforcing the front lines near Kursk, can be exploited by Ukraine and used against him. That brings us to a secondary reason why Ukraine may have moved into Kursk. Ukraine is showing that it, along with many of its supporters, is unafraid of crossing a red line. We touched on this earlier when we talked about how several Western nations are allowing Ukraine to use their weapons to attack Russia in its own territory. Perhaps the Kursk incursion is an extension of that. Ukraine will not only fire missiles behind the front lines, but it will actively take Russian territory to show Putin that it's just as capable of invading and fighting within Russia as Russia is of invading Ukraine. Interestingly, Ukraine may even have a modicum of support from the US with this incursion. Though the US is still seeking answers from Ukraine, as we mentioned earlier, the White House also pointed out that the restrictions the US has in place for the use of its weapons in Russia's territory haven't changed. Tellingly, White House spokesman John Kirby went on to say that the Kursk incursion was not a violation of our policy. So the US is looking for common-sense answers, but Ukraine's actions are very unlikely to cause any tensions between it and its most powerful Western ally. So we have two potential reasons for the Kursk incursion so far. Ukraine has used it to stretch Russia's forces along the front lines, potentially relieving pressure in Donetsk. And also it may be using the incursion to showcase just how far it and its Western allies are now willing to step over the red lines that previously prevented Ukraine from doing anything but defend itself against Putin's special military operation. But there's another reason why Ukraine may have chosen now to take territory in Kursk: negotiations. In May 2024, reports started surfacing about Putin being ready to end the Ukraine war through a negotiated ceasefire that would recognize the front lines at the time. From that ceasefire, Russia would enter deeper negotiations that would likely see it try to claim the Ukrainian territory it controlled at the time. That would have seen it essentially take much of the Donbass, including Luhansk and Donetsk, as well as southern regions such as Mariupol. In other words, Russia had a powerful negotiating position. No matter how faltering its invasion of Ukraine may have been, it had still successfully taken territory and was now ready to end the war, claiming that territory permanently. Reuters noted that several sources inside the Kremlin believe Putin was ready to push for these negotiations. One of the 5 it spoke to claimed, "Putin can fight for as long as it takes, but Putin is also ready for a ceasefire, to freeze the war." Putin himself had practically said as much during a May press conference he held in Belarus, in which he said, "Let them resume," when talking about the possibility of negotiations opening. However, that resumption could only happen if the negotiations were based on the realities on the ground. Ukraine would have to cede territory for Russia to stop. And worst of all, Ukraine had no leverage that it could bring to the negotiating table. With the taking of around 20 villages and a key gas distribution system in Kursk, Ukraine now has leverage. It's possible that Ukraine has taken this territory intending to hold it for the long term. If that's the case, we'll see more troops funneling into Kursk in the coming days. Remember that Ukraine sent an extra 2,000 to support the 1,000 who entered, and more territory taken. Should Russia and Ukraine enter negotiations while Ukraine still controls this territory, it finally has some leverage to bring to ceasefire talk. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky could tell Putin that he would be willing to trade the territory in Kursk for some of the Ukrainian territory Russia has taken. Whether that approach would work, or if Russia would be willing to enter negotiations when Ukraine controls some of its territory, remains to be seen. Which brings us to the final big question we'll ask in this video: what comes next? Russia's response, for one thing. In the immediate aftermath of the Kursk invasion, the oblast's regional governor, Alexei Smirnov, declared a state of emergency. He claimed the move was necessary to eliminate the consequences of enemy forces coming into the region. Air alerts were issued over Kursk, with Russia scrambling fighter jets, which the BBC says were filmed flying low to the ground over the region on the hunt for Ukrainian soldiers. This footage lends credence to Mikhailo Zhrokov's claims that Russia was diverting fighter jets from the Donetsk region to handle its Kursk crisis. Meanwhile, Ukrainian politicians have found themselves just as curious about the reasons behind the incursion as everybody else. Speaking on Facebook, Alexei Honcharенko, a member of Ukraine's parliament, claimed the attacks has led to the taking of territory before adding that he didn't know what the plan was. However, he claimed it would show Europeans and Americans that Russia can and needs to be attacked. Again, the message here is to support Ukraine in crossing even more red lines. After all, this is the first time since World War II that any Russian territory has been occupied by an opposing force. And as Honcharенko points out, Putin did not turn to nukes and so on, meaning Ukraine is showing the world that the world should not be scared of escalation or the reaction of Putin. Another humiliation for Putin. Despite all of the threats he's made during the war, which have included threats of deploying tactical nuclear weapons, red line after red line has now been crossed. Now he has Ukrainian troops in his territory and he hasn't followed through on any of his threats. Is that because he's smart enough to know that going nuclear would lead to World War III? Or is he not following through on his threats because he knows that Russia couldn't handle a war with NATO and the US after having depleted itself so thoroughly in Ukraine? Back in Russia, Andrei Belyusov, who became Russia's defense minister in May 2024 after previously serving as the country's first deputy prime minister for 4 years, faces his first major test. Part of passing that test appears to be taking part in the Kremlin's efforts to turn the incursion into pro-Russian propaganda. Putin is spearheading this campaign, claiming on the second day of the incursion that Ukraine's actions were not only a major provocation, but that its soldiers were firing indiscriminately at civilians, their homes, and Kursk's public buildings. Those claims aren't yet confirmed. Militaristically, Russia has clearly sent forces into Kursk to push back the Ukrainian advance, though it's unclear how successful they've been. Valery Gerasimov, Russia's chief of general staff, claims that Russia is continuing to destroy the adversary in areas directly adjacent to the Russian-Ukrainian border. That's a statement vague enough to suggest that Ukraine is still in Kursk and Russia hasn't been able to repel the 1,000 soldiers in the territory just yet. Even worse for the Kremlin is that these public claims of pushing back Ukraine are being disputed on Telegram, which is Russia's most popular social media channel. Several pro-war channels on the network claim the situation is far worse for Russia than the politicians are claiming. One such channel, Rybar, says that the situation is continuing to deteriorate, while noting that Ukrainian formations were advancing towards towns. Again, those claims aren't confirmed either. It all adds up to a confused state of affairs, in which we know Ukrainian soldiers are in Kursk, but we're still uncertain exactly how successful or otherwise they are following the initial taking of villages and a gas distribution station. Add claims of captured Russian soldiers into the mix and you get even more confusion. An August 9th report in the Kyiv Independent claims that drone footage published by Ukraine shows 32 captured Russian soldiers, adding that the Telegram post that showcased the footage claimed that a further 8 were out of frame. More claims were being made, but they offered yet another example of claims that can't be verified independently. What is clear is that the Kursk incursion shows a change in Ukrainian tactics. For over 2 years, it has bedded into its own territory, fortifying to enable it to defend against slow Russian advances. That approach has proved lethal for Russia. It's lost 588,540 soldiers since the start of the war, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Defense. But now, whittling away at the seemingly never-ending stream of soldiers Putin is sending into Ukraine isn't enough for Zelensky. The incursion into Kursk shows that Ukraine is willing to go on the attack, which will send shockwaves throughout Russia as Putin realizes that his country is no longer safe behind the front lines of the Ukraine war. That change in approach could lead to consequences for Ukraine in the long run. That could especially be the case in Africa, where the BBC claims Ukraine has been trying to win allies during the war with Russia. Over the last 3 days, Mali and Niger have both cut diplomatic ties with Ukraine, ostensibly over comments by a Ukrainian military official who suggested that Ukraine may have played a role in the killing of several dozen Malian soldiers in July 2024. Those soldiers were working alongside mercenaries from the infamous Wagner Group and were apparently killed in clashes with al-Qaeda-linked militants. Andriy Yusov claimed in the immediate aftermath that the separatist rebels the Malian soldiers fought received the necessary information they needed to carry out their attacks. An unsubstantiated comment, but one that has triggered Mali, Niger, and Senegal to cut ties with Ukraine, all coincidentally right as Ukrainian troops entered Kursk. It's possible that the Kremlin put pressure on all three to do so, with Ukraine calling Mali's decision short-sighted and hasty, while claiming that it complies with all aspects of international law. Perhaps Ukraine wasn't involved in the killing of Malian troops at all. Instead, we may be seeing Russian influence-based politics at play again, as it labels Ukraine as the aggressor while using the Kursk incursion to prove its point. Ukraine loses 3 potential African allies, or at least 3 countries with which it could deepen diplomatic ties, and Russia forces a small propaganda victory. That's all conjecture, but it shows that Ukraine's differing approach to handling Russia could have ramifications on a wider scale. What isn't conjecture is that Ukraine's latest actions aren't part of the Russian plan. None of this is. The special military operation in Ukraine was supposed to be short, sharp, and devastating. Now Russia is bogged down in a protracted war that has not only cost it hundreds of thousands of soldiers and huge amounts of military equipment, but is now seeing it lose territory to a country that it's trying to conquer. The plan is failing. And with that, we'll ask you what you think about Ukraine's incursion into Kursk. Is this the start of a new approach that will see Ukraine taking even more Russian territory in the future? Or is it a short-term crossing of a red line designed to stretch Russia's troops? How do you think Putin will respond to the humiliation he's experienced as a result of this incursion? For the first time since the Gulf War, Western and Russian tanks, once built to crush each other in a Cold War showdown, are finally facing off on the battlefield. The result? Once again, a decisive edge in the favor of Western tanks, which showed themselves to not only be superior tank for tank, but better equipped to handle the realities of modern armored warfare. But what makes these tanks so unstoppable? How are they outmaneuvering and outlasting their Russian rivals and sending shockwaves through Putin's ranks? Could this be the turning point that shifts the balance of power in Ukraine's favor? Stick around as we unravel the answers to these game-changing questions. As of August 6, 2024, the Oryx blog confirms that Russia has lost a staggering 3,304 tanks, with 2,258 of these completely destroyed, amounting to a consistent destruction rate of 68% throughout the war. In stark contrast, Ukraine's modern Western tanks are proving to be far more resilient on the battlefield. Ukraine's Soviet-era tanks like the T-64s and T-72s have understandably suffered significant losses given their outdated designs. However, when it comes to Western tanks, the story is entirely different. Of the approximately 91 Leopard tanks Ukraine's deployed, only 18 Leopard 2A4 tanks have been destroyed, just 45% of those that have seen combat. The Abrams tanks tell a similar story. Out of around 25 tanks, only 4 have been destroyed, a mere 36%. These numbers highlight a crucial advantage. Ukraine's Western tanks are not only surviving on the battlefield but are outlasting and outperforming their Russian counterparts. This stark difference in survivability is a testament to a superior design, technology, and strategic doctrine behind Western tanks, factors that are now making a decisive impact in Ukraine's favor. But what happens when these armored giants meet face-to-face on the battlefield? Artillery, drones, and man-portable anti-tank weapons have accounted for a lot of the tank losses on both sides, but tanks cannot be matched in the forward momentum they generate by being able to storm enemy positions and provide protective close-fire support to infantry. When used properly, they can be at the forefront of offensive operations that capture a lot of territory. Tanks supported by infantry, artillery, and air power helped to break the deadlock of trench warfare in World War I, and they've not changed much in this function since. The United States and other Western countries designed their tanks brilliantly to play this role as part of combined arms operations. The US military's experience in Iraq further reinforced the importance of having tanks and infantry closely supporting each other. Dismounted infantry was vital in supporting tanks against ambushes during the War on Terror, especially in urban environments. But tanks didn't just rely on infantry, they evolved to protect them in return. America's Abrams tanks got steadily thicker and more protective turrets since they were introduced in the 1980s. The thicker turrets better protect the tank and its 4-man crew against threats from above, which is common in urban warfare and from modern anti-tank guided missiles. By staying on the battlefield longer, infantry got more support and valuable tank crews were protected. But armor isn't the only advantage. Western tanks also excel in gun mobility, setting them apart. The Abrams, for example, can raise its turret by 60 degrees or lower it by 20. Such mobility ensures that it can fire on a broad array of targets and support infantry in many situations, especially urban combat. In stark contrast, Russian tanks struggle with crippling limitations, leaving them outmatched and desperate to keep up. The main units in its arsenal, the T-72, T-80, and T-90, can only raise their guns to an angle of 14 degrees upward and 6 degrees downward. Such limitations mean they can't match their Western counterparts in range. For example, the T-72's limited elevation puts its gun's maximum effective firing range at about 2 to 3 kilometers. The M1 Abrams can fire up to 4, thanks to the greater flexibility afforded by its gun design. The limited flexibility of the guns on Russian tanks made them easy prey to enemy tanks in the Gulf War and to ambush from infantry in the Chechen Wars. Many tanks were destroyed in places like Grozny at the hands of Chechen rebels armed with RPGs, firing down at the armor from rooftops or upwards from basements. The miserable experience in Grozny revealed that Russian tanks also didn't take hits well. If damaged from even a basic anti-tank weapon like an RPG, there was a high chance that the entire platform would be destroyed, and their valuable crew members with them. The problem was that the Russian tanks did not separate the ammunition compartment from the main body of the vehicle. If they took damage, there was a high chance of a chain reaction in the magazine that would blow the turret off the tank in a jack-in-the-box explosion. The same has been true for Russian tanks in Ukraine on a wide scale. One of the first confirmed examples of a T-90 tank being destroyed in the war came at the hands of a Ukrainian soldier using a Carl Gustaf recoilless rifle. The tank was of the T-90M variant, supposedly one of the world's most advanced main battle tanks. In actuality, the T-90 is a late Soviet derivative of the T-72, combined with certain features from the T-80, but the Carl Gustaf was even older. Although it's seen significant improvements since its introduction, the Carl Gustaf made its debut in 1948. If an RPG or a Carl Gustaf round can prove so devastating to Russian armor, one can expect to see a lot of destroyed tanks at the hands of infantry, which is exactly what has happened. In the few instances in Ukraine where Russian tanks have dared to go head-to-head, the results have been devastatingly familiar, mirroring the defeats in the Gulf War. One of the problems is that Russian tanks like the T-72 need to get relatively close to an enemy tank to ensure their guns have enough power to penetrate the armor. For example, when going against an Abrams, the T-72 must come within 1 kilometer to be confident about its stopping power. This is a dangerous range, especially on a modern battlefield. Russian tanks are also equipped with auto-loaders, which is why they have crews of 3. There's no need for a 4th crew member to load the ammunition into the gun. There are drawbacks to this though. The auto-loader actually has a slower rate of fire, and having only 3 men makes repairs more difficult. Western tanks come with crews of 4, including a dedicated loader. These manned loaders are often faster than the Russian autoloaders. The Abrams, for example, can fire 9 rounds per minute compared to the T-72's 8. The presence of a 4th man also makes field maintenance and repair of the tank easier. Although this might seem like a minor difference, it's played out in a big way in Ukraine. At least 890 Russian tanks have been abandoned or captured to this point in the war because they're often poorly maintained in the field. In contrast, 201 Ukrainian tanks have been abandoned or captured. Of the Abrams and Leopard-type tanks Ukraine has lost in that way, 19 have been abandoned, but only after suffering severe damage in the field. Ukraine's Soviet-type tanks are more likely to be abandoned on the spot. For example, Ukraine's T-64 tanks are a lot likelier to be abandoned without taking any significant damage, but none of Ukraine's Western tanks listed on Oryx are categorized as being simply abandoned or captured. They're all listed as being damaged and abandoned. The crew of 4 can keep their tanks better repaired and less likely to be abandoned before a firefight than the 3-man Russian tank crews. These problems are built into the Russian tanks because of the philosophical doctrine they were supposed to carry out. Russian generals envisioned large waves of tanks destroying NATO forces through sheer weight of numbers. Therefore, the tanks needed to be cheap and easy to replace. Making them more survivable would have made them more expensive. Quantity was supposed to take precedence over quality. The design originates with the Soviet Union's deep battle doctrine, which emerged after the First World War. The Soviet officers wanted to avoid a repeat of that experience at all costs. The Soviet answer to the pitfalls of trench warfare was to send wave after wave of armored units in a bid to keep the line moving forward. Breakthroughs needed to be exploited in wide and deep offensives for hundreds of kilometers. Inevitable losses taken in this process needed to be quickly replaced. Replaceable losses matter even more when one considers how costly the deep battle doctrine can be. Even when it goes right, many casualties can be expected. The greatest example was the Soviet Union always taking more casualties than Nazi Germany in World War II, even when the Red Army was at its most effective. If a lot of losses can be expected in conducting operations, it made little sense to make the tanks too expensive, especially at a time when the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact satellite states significantly outnumbered their NATO enemies. Russia's T-72, T-80 and T-90 tanks were designed to carry out this doctrine, so all 3 are built on its assumptions. The more archaic tanks in the Russian fleet, like the T-62 and T-54-55, were also based on these premises. Russia was unable to find a way to fix these problems in its existing tanks. Although the deep battle doctrine never changed, Moscow at least noticed some of the problems in the T-72 and its descendants after the Gulf War and the Chechen Wars, so it tried to bring a new tank to its army, the T-14 Armata. In theory, this tank should have solved the issues that plagued the Soviet-era tanks. The Armata has a more flexible gun that can fire at a greater distance. It also offers more protection for its crews. Unlike the older tanks, the Armata keeps its crew in a specialized capsule that's sealed off from the magazine, preventing the turret from getting blown off if it suffers damage. Its new gun also has greater stopping power. These features had NATO officials fearing what would happen if the Russian tanks met their member states' tanks in combat. These fears were exaggerated because Russia's modernization effort turned into a gigantic, decade-long disaster. Russia could never mass-produce these tanks because they were designed around the wrong engine. This engine is a Russian version of the German X-shaped simmering SLA-16 engine. Known as the A85-3 in Russia, this engine was not designed for a tank. Instead, it was created for compressing oil and for use in gas stations. However, the Russians were attracted to the engine's power and compact size. Although these attributes made it heavier than the traditional Russian tank engine, the trade-off seemed worth it. Unfortunately for Moscow, doing the most basic research would have revealed that this engine did not sell on the international market for a few reasons. It was complicated, and these complications created operating problems. It was also hard to maintain. The Russians thought they would be able to solve these problems over time, but then they made their second and even bigger mistake. They designed the Armata around this engine, rather than designing the engine for the tank. Russian engineers have been trying to fix the problem ever since. Because of its design, the Armata cannot be readjusted to fit Russia's traditional tank engine, the V92S2F. Only about 20 T-14 Armata tanks have ever been produced. Russian factories are incapable of producing them at scale, and they have not played any part in the war. The Armata could have been a formidable threat to the Ukrainian cause. It would have had more range, firepower, and been harder to kill. It would have preserved the lives of more of the Russian tank crews. The Armata's failure means that Russia can only produce more of the same units that have already proven unquestionable, as Ukraine gets more Western tanks. NATO countries designed their tanks around a different doctrine. Knowing that they would be outnumbered in a confrontation with the Soviet Union, they had to make them survivable and lethal. Each NATO tank needed to be worth more than one Russian tank. As a result, they had to provide enhanced protection and keep their crews alive and firing at the enemy for longer. Sealing the ammunition magazine from the crew compartment was only one example of this. Western tanks have more sophisticated armor than their Russian counterparts. The Abrams has armor made of composite materials that includes ceramics and depleted uranium, in addition to the typical metal. An active defense system that responds to and shoots down incoming projectiles and explosive reactive armor add to the tank's defense. In fact, the Abrams has had so many defensive features that the Army brass has begun to worry about its weight, which is currently over 73 tons. The coming M1A3 Abrams will be designed to shed some of this weight without sacrificing the better protection and firepower that have accrued to it. In contrast, Russian tanks have armor that's more basic. The T-90 has the most advanced set of the lot. Called the Contact 5, this armor is a multi-layered composite system. Active defense systems like infrared signals that block the targeting of anti-tank guided missiles are also a part of the defense suite, as are explosive reactive armor panels, when they haven't fallen into the hands of corrupt Russian logistics officers looking to make a quick buck. While an improvement on the T-80 and T-72, the T-90 is still not as protective as the Abrams. The proof might be that 153 T-90 tanks have been documented as losses. 59% of these have been destroyed. That's a lower destruction rate than Russia's tanks as a whole, but it's still far higher than the Abrams and Leopard tanks that have become casualties in Ukraine. Defense is not the T-90 and other Russian tanks' only disadvantage against their Western enemies. Because it came from Cold War expectations that it would be outnumbered, the Abrams is designed to get the first shot against its enemies, which partially explains its longer range and more flexible guns. The newer versions of the Abrams are almost complete redesigns that take this principle much further. The original 105mm gun has long been upgraded to a 120mm weapon with greater range and stopping power. The Pentagon originally planned to donate the latest M1A2 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, but eventually decided to send the older M1A1 models instead because they would be easier to deliver. Although these are not as advanced, they got upgraded and digitized fire control systems in the 2000s. Some of the features include an independent thermal viewer that provides the tank commander with stabilized day and night vision over 360 degrees, automatic sensor scanning, automatic target queuing for the gunner's sight, and backup systems in case these go down. The new fire control system made observation and target acquisition much easier than in the original Abrams. Russia upgraded its tanks to have digital fire control systems too, but only about a quarter of the 2,600 tanks in its operational pre-war battle fleet were modernized with such systems. Ukraine has long blown past the 650 tanks that were updated with modern systems. Most of Russia's best tanks before the war have been destroyed. International sanctions have made it difficult for Russia to create tanks of the same quality as the ones they had before. For the moment, Russia is meeting its baseline needs by importing parts from China through the dual-use loophole in the international sanctions policy. This loophole allows for such imports if technologies serve civilian needs. These Chinese technologies have been found in destroyed Russian equipment, including tanks, replacing earlier French fire control systems. Although they're lower in quality, they are functional enough for Russia to continue its small offensives. In January 2024, the UK Ministry of Defence suggested that Russian industry could produce about 100 new tanks per month, making its losses sustainable at current rates. However, there is a giant loophole in that announcement. Many of these supposedly new tanks are likely older units from the Cold War that Russia is taking out of storage. Russia has long been resorting to supposedly retired T-62 tanks and has lost at least 175 of these units. It's lost at least 95 T-64 tanks too. These units are unlikely to have been thoroughly modernized. They were simply deployed to support Russia's so-called meat tactics. The vast majority of Ukraine's tank fleet remains Soviet-era units. However, the influx of Western tanks means that Ukraine's fleet has steadily gotten more modern, while its rivals has steadily gotten more archaic. In 2023, when they first started to get their hands on Western tanks, Ukrainian crews were full of praise. In every area from speed to protection to firepower, rate of fire, and maneuverability, they were superior. This superiority was proven in the Gulf War, when American Abrams and British Challenger tanks easily defeated the T-72 and T-80 tanks in Iraq's arsenal. Colonel Hamish de Breton Gordon, a former commander of the British Royal Tank Regiment who saw action in that conflict, remarked that the West tanks could take 10 shots from a T-72, while one shot from a Western tank would do the job on a Soviet version. Such battles have been rare in Ukraine, but survivability and range matter even more in the era of drones and precision artillery strikes than they did in the Gulf War. The range, networking options, and survivability of the Western tanks means that they have the advantage in this type of war. The casualty figures bear this out. What's coming next in the tank battles of Ukraine? Will more Western tanks arrive soon and coordinate with the newly arrived F-16s for combined air and ground operations?